Kodiak. The morning of April 1st, 2025, dawned cold and grey over Kodiak Island, Alaska, with a wind that cut through the spruce forests like a knife through canvas, carrying with it the scent of the sea and something else, something ancient and hungry that had been waking from its winter torpor in the mountains above Karluk Lake. Frank Joseph Dawson stood on the weathered deck of his cabin at precisely 6:47 a.m., his arthritic hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug that read, "World's Best Grandpa," a gift from his daughter Sarah 3 Christmases ago, watching the slate-colored clouds roll across the peaks of the Kodiak National Wildlife Refuge with the practiced eye of a man who had spent 52 years reading the moods of this unforgiving landscape. At 74 years old, Frank carried himself with the careful dignity of someone who understood that age had not diminished his capabilities, but had merely required him to be more deliberate in their application. His 6'2" frame still imposing, despite the slight stoop that had developed in his shoulders over the past decade. His hands gnarled but steady, his pale blue eyes sharp as ever beneath bushy grey eyebrows that his late wife Margaret used to say looked like storm clouds themselves. The cabin stood at the end of a 6-mile gravel road that branched off from the Karluk Road, itself barely more than a maintained track that connected the remote western side of Kodiak Island to the handful of fishing lodges and hunting camps scattered along the coast. And Frank's property encompassed 47 acres of prime wilderness that backed up against federal land, a sprawling territory that included dense Sitka spruce forests, muskeg bogs that could swallow a man if he didn't know where to step, and a small creek that ran year-round with water so cold it could stop your heart if you fell in. He had purchased this land in 1983 with Margaret, back when he was still young enough to believe he was immortal and foolish enough to think that the wilderness would always remain exactly as he found it. And they had built the cabin themselves over the course of 2 summers, hauling materials by boat and truck, cutting timber from their own land, designing it to be both comfortable and practical with its high-pitched roof to shed the heavy snow, its thick walls insulated against the brutal winter cold, and its wraparound deck that offered views of the mountains to the east and the ocean to the west on those rare, clear days when you could see all the way to the horizon. Inside the cabin, Frank had created what he liked to call his museum, though others who had seen it described it in terms ranging from impressive to disturbing, depending on their relationship with hunting and their tolerance for taxidermy. The main room, which served as living room, dining room and gallery all at once, measured 32 feet by 24 feet with cathedral ceilings that soared to 18 feet at the peak, and mounted on every available wall surface were the trophies of a lifetime spent guiding wealthy hunters through some of the most dangerous game country in North America. There was the massive brown bear, a 10-foot-tall boar that Frank had shot in self-defense in 1987 when it charged him and a client on the Aleutian Peninsula, its lips curled back in a permanent snarl, its claws each the length of a man's finger. There was the Dall sheep with its perfect curl of horns, taken at elevation on the Alaska Peninsula after a 3-day stalk that had nearly killed Frank and his client with exhaustion. There was the bull moose with a rack that spread 72 inches, the mountain goat with its pristine white coat, the wolverine frozen in mid-snarl, the lynx with its tufted ears, and dozens of smaller specimens, including foxes, marten, river otters, and birds ranging from ptarmigan to bald eagles. But the centerpiece, the mount that dominated the room and drew the eye of everyone who entered, was the Kodiak bear that occupied the entire north wall, a monster of an animal that stood 11 feet tall on its hind legs with its paws raised as if about to strike, its mouth open to display teeth that could crush bone like breadsticks, its dark brown fur thick and lustrous even in death. Frank had killed this bear in 1994 under circumstances that he rarely discussed in detail. an encounter that had left him with scars on his left shoulder and a limp that plagued him in cold weather. And he had paid almost $40,000 to have it mounted by the best taxidermist in Alaska, a man named Viktor Petrov, who had learned his craft in Russia and who had a reputation for creating mounts so lifelike they seemed about to step down from their pedestals. The bear's eyes, made of hand-blown glass by an artist in Seattle, caught the light in a way that made them seem alive, following visitors around the room with an intensity that made some people uncomfortable, and Frank had positioned it so that it was the first thing you saw when you walked through the front door, a statement of dominance, a declaration that he was a man who had conquered the wilderness and brought its most fearsome predator into his home as decoration. The taxidermy collection represented more than just hunting success. It represented Frank's entire professional legacy, and according to 3 different appraisers he had consulted over the years, approximately $214,000 in fair market value, not counting the sentimental worth of pieces like the brown bear that had nearly killed him, or the caribou he had shot on the first trip he had guided after getting his professional license in 1973. He kept meticulous records in a filing cabinet in his office, a small room off the main cabin that contained decades of photographs, client testimonials, hunting journals, maps marked with kill sites and game trails, and careful documentation of every animal he had ever taken or guided a client to take, complete with dates, locations, field measurements, and often stories written in his precise handwriting about the circumstances of each hunt. Frank had been a registered guide for 47 years before officially retiring in 2020, though he still occasionally took old clients out if they asked, and if he felt up to the physical demands. And in that time, he had guided over 300 hunts, mostly for brown bears and Kodiak bears, but also for other species throughout Alaska and occasionally in Canada and Russia. He had developed a reputation as one of the most skilled and safety-conscious guides in the state, a man who knew the country intimately and who had never lost a client to injury or death, a perfect record that he took tremendous pride in, even as he acknowledged that luck had played as much a role as skill in maintaining it. His clients had included doctors, lawyers, businessmen, politicians, even a few celebrities whose names he kept confidential, and they had paid him anywhere from $8,000 to $35,000 per hunt, depending on the species, the duration, and the level of accommodation, with the trophy Kodiak bear hunts commanding the highest prices because of their danger, difficulty, and the limited number of tags issued by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game each year. Margaret had died 18 months ago, in October of 2023, after a brief and brutal fight with pancreatic cancer that had gone from diagnosis to death in just under 4 months, and Frank had not handled her loss well, retreating into himself, seeing fewer friends, speaking less frequently with his daughter Sarah, who lived in Anchorage with her husband David and their 2 children. Spending more and more time alone in the cabin, surrounded by his trophies and his memories. He had always been somewhat solitary by nature, a man comfortable with silence and his own company. But Margaret had been his connection to the wider world, the one who organized dinners with friends, who called Sarah regularly, who made sure they attended community events in Kodiak town. And without her, Frank had found himself drifting further into isolation, into a routine that consisted of waking early, drinking coffee, working on small projects around the property, eating simple meals, and going to bed early day after day with little variation except for the weather. His daughter Sarah Brennan worried about him constantly, a worry that had intensified over the past 6 months as their phone conversations had become shorter and less frequent, as he had made excuses to avoid visiting Anchorage for Christmas, and then again for his granddaughter Emily's 8th birthday in February. Sarah was 46 years old, a psychiatric nurse at Alaska Regional Hospital who had inherited her father's height and her mother's empathy, and she had been trying without much success to convince Frank to sell the cabin and move to Anchorage, where she could keep an eye on him, where he could be closer to medical care, where he wouldn't be alone in the wilderness with no neighbors within miles. But Frank was stubborn, a trait that Sarah had also inherited, and he had resisted every argument she made with a calm determination that frustrated her even as she understood it. "I built this place with my own hands," he had told her during their last phone conversation on March 28th, exactly 4 days before the incident that would end his life. "Your mother and I raised you here, Summers. This is my home, Sarah. I'm not leaving it to rot just because I'm getting old. I can still take care of myself." But the truth, which Frank would not have admitted to his daughter or anyone else, was that taking care of himself had become increasingly difficult. The arthritis in his hands made it hard to grip things firmly, and he had dropped and broken 3 coffee mugs in the past month alone. His left knee, injured in a hunting accident in 1991, had been bothering him more than usual, sometimes giving out without warning and nearly sending him to the ground. His hearing had deteriorated to the point where he missed sounds that he would have picked up instantly even 5 years ago, the subtle noises of the forest that had once alerted him to the presence of game or danger. He had trouble sleeping, often waking multiple times a night with leg cramps or needing to use the bathroom, and the fatigue accumulated over days and weeks until he sometimes found himself nodding off in his chair in the middle of the afternoon. He had stopped climbing up to check on the game trails in the high country behind his property, a seasonal activity he had performed religiously for decades. He no longer cut his own firewood, but instead paid a local service to deliver split wood twice a year. He had even stopped doing his regular perimeter walks around the property boundary, something he had done weekly without fail since 1983. What Frank didn't realize, couldn't have realized, was that this last change in his routine would prove fatal, because if he had been walking his property line regularly, he would have noticed the signs that a large male Kodiak bear had moved into the area and had been gradually expanding its territory to include the land around Frank's cabin. The bear, later identified by wildlife biologists as a 23-year-old male, weighing approximately 1,300 pounds and measuring 9.5 feet from nose to tail, had emerged from hibernation on March 15th in a den located roughly 8 miles northeast of Frank's property, near the headwaters of Sturgeon Creek, in a remote section of the Kodiak National Wildlife Refuge where few humans ever ventured. This bear, which biologists would later designate as Bear 341 based on its genetic profile, was old for a Kodiak bear in the wild, past its prime but still formidable, and it had been exhibiting increasingly aggressive behavior over the past several years, according to reports filed with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game by other guides and residents in the area. In 2022, Bear 341 had broken into a hunting camp near Uganik Bay and destroyed thousands of dollars worth of supplies, and in 2023 it had charged 2 separate groups of hikers, though in both cases it had stopped short of making contact, exhibiting what wildlife behaviorists call a false charge, intended to intimidate rather than injure. The bear had also been involved in several incidents of food conditioning, having learned to associate humans with easy meals after scavenging gut piles left by hunters and raiding improperly secured garbage at remote cabins. Alaska Department of Fish and Game wildlife technician Robert Chen had actually recommended that Bear 341 be relocated, or if that proved impractical, destroyed. But his recommendation had been overruled by his supervisor, a woman named Patricia Valdez, who believed that the bear's behavior could still be modified through better public education about food storage, and that lethal action should be reserved only for bears that had actually attacked humans. This decision, made with the best intentions and based on standard wildlife management protocols, would be second-guessed endlessly in the aftermath of what happened to Frank Dawson, but at the time it seemed reasonable, even compassionate. Bears were protected in Alaska, their populations carefully managed through controlled hunting seasons and strict regulations, and the philosophy guiding wildlife management was that human-bear conflicts were almost always the result of human error rather than innate bear aggression. If people would just secure their food properly, store their garbage correctly, and give bears adequate space, the thinking went, then dangerous encounters could be largely avoided. This philosophy had served Alaska well for decades, and incidents of serious bear attacks remained relatively rare, despite the large bear populations. But it relied on humans following the rules and on bears behaving predictably, and neither of these conditions always held true. Bear 341 had spent the 2 weeks since emerging from hibernation in a state of hyperphagia, the biological imperative that drives bears to consume massive amounts of food after the long winter fast, and it had been ranging widely across its territory, seeking anything edible. In the early spring, before the salmon runs began and before the berries ripened, food was scarce, and the bear had been forced to work hard for every calorie, digging up roots, overturning logs to find insects, scavenging winter-killed carrion, and covering enormous distances in its search for sustenance. The bear was hungry, not just with the ordinary hunger that any animal feels, but with the deep, consuming hunger that drives a large predator to take risks it might otherwise avoid, to approach human habitation more closely than caution would dictate, to investigate any potential food source, no matter how unusual or risky. On March 29th, Bear 341 had picked up the scent of Frank's cabin from nearly 2 miles away, carried on the wind that blew predominantly from the southwest this time of year, and the bear had detected the complex mixture of smells that indicated human presence. Wood smoke, cooking odors, the sharp tang of diesel fuel from the generator, and underneath it all the organic smells of a human habitation occupied for decades. But the bear had also detected another smell, one that triggered something deep in its predatory brain, a scent that was simultaneously familiar and provocative. The smell of other bears, specifically the smell of bear hide and fur, the processed and preserved skins of dozens of bears that hung on Frank's walls inside his temperature-controlled cabin, where their scents leaked out slowly through the ventilation system and the gaps around doors and windows. To Bear 341, these smells created confusion and curiosity. The scent signature suggested that this was territory occupied by multiple bears, competitors, or potential mates. Yet there were no other behavioral signs of bear presence, no scat, no claw marks on trees, no overturned logs or dug-up earth. The cognitive dissonance created by this situation, the inability to reconcile contradictory sensory information, led the bear to approach more closely than it otherwise might have, and over the course of the next several days, from March 29th through April 2nd, Bear 341 established a pattern of nocturnal visits to the area around Frank's cabin, gradually growing bolder, moving from the tree line to the clearing, from the clearing to the structures, learning Frank's routine, learning when he was active and when he was asleep, learning that this human lived alone and that he was elderly and potentially vulnerable. Frank himself remained completely unaware of these visits. His degraded hearing meant he didn't detect the sounds of a 1,300-pound animal moving through the forest at night. His habit of going to bed early and sleeping heavily, aided by the 2 shots of whiskey he allowed himself each evening, meant he didn't see the bear's massive shape moving past his windows. His failure to install motion-activated lights or cameras, which he had always considered unnecessary given his remote location and his own vigilance, meant he had no way of documenting or even knowing about the bear's presence. And his decision, made unconsciously and without any awareness of its significance, to leave his front door propped open on the afternoon of April 3rd to air out the cabin after he had burned a pot of soup on the stove, would prove to be the final mistake in a series of small, innocent decisions that accumulated into catastrophe. But on the morning of April 1st, Frank knew nothing of the danger that was circling his home, and he stood on his deck, drinking his coffee and thinking about the projects he wanted to complete before the tourist season began in earnest in May. He needed to replace several boards on the deck that had rotted through over the winter. He wanted to patch the roof over the storage shed where he kept his tools and his four-wheeler. He was considering taking down a large spruce that had died and was threatening to fall on his power line, and he was thinking about whether he had the energy to guide one more hunt, just one more, if his old client Raymond Whitmore called from Texas like he did every spring to ask if Frank was available for a brown bear hunt in the fall. The wind gusted hard enough to make the spruce trees surrounding the cabin groan and sway, and Frank tossed the dregs of his coffee over the deck railing, watching the liquid arc through the cold air before spattering on the ground below. He went back inside, closing the door firmly behind him, and set about making his breakfast. 2 eggs fried in butter, 3 strips of bacon, 2 pieces of toast with strawberry jam, and more coffee. A meal that his doctor in Kodiak Town had told him was far too high in cholesterol and fat, but which Frank continued to eat anyway because he was 74 years old and figured he had earned the right to eat what he wanted. As he cooked, he looked around his cabin, at the trophies that covered the walls, at the furniture that he and Margaret had chosen together, at the photographs that documented a life spent in this place, and he felt the satisfaction of a man who had built something permanent, who had carved out a piece of wilderness and made it his own, who had succeeded by his own definition, even if the world had mostly moved on without noticing or caring. His neighbor, the closest human being to Frank's cabin, was Thomas Kincaid, who lived 3.5 miles to the south in a somewhat smaller cabin that Thomas used primarily as a summer fishing retreat, though he kept it winterized and occasionally visited during the colder months. Thomas was 61 years old, a retired accountant from Oregon who had fallen in love with Alaska during a fishing trip in 1998 and had bought his property in 2001, and while he and Frank were not close friends, they maintained the kind of cordial, mutually respectful relationship common among people who lived in remote areas and understood that they might need each other in an emergency. They checked in with each other every few weeks, usually by radio since cell phone coverage was spotty at best and non-existent at worst in this part of the island. And they had an informal arrangement that if either of them failed to respond to radio contact for more than 48 hours, the other would come check on them. Thomas had driven out to his cabin on March 30th to open it up for the season and to do some early fishing in the creek that ran through his property, and he had checked in with Frank via radio that evening, the two of them exchanging pleasantries and weather observations before signing off. Thomas had not heard from Frank since then, but that was not unusual. Sometimes they went a week or more without talking, and besides, Thomas had other things on his mind. His wife Diane was flying up from Oregon on April 5th, and he wanted to have the cabin clean and ready for her arrival, wanted to have a nice dinner prepared, wanted everything to be perfect because they were celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary, and because Diane had not been enthusiastic about spending the anniversary in the Alaska bush, but had agreed because Thomas loved it so much. The only other person who lived within any reasonable distance of Frank's cabin was Jennifer Yazzie, a wildlife photographer and researcher who occupied a small research station about 7 miles to the northwest, near the boundary of the Kodiak National Wildlife Refuge. Jennifer was 34 years old, originally from the Navajo Nation in New Mexico, and she had been studying bear behavior on Kodiak Island for 6 years as part of her doctoral work at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. She lived alone at the research station for weeks or months at a time, monitoring remote cameras, collecting scat samples, documenting bear movements, and generally pursuing her research with an intensity that concerned her advisor back in Fairbanks, who worried that Jennifer took too many risks and spent too much time alone in the wilderness without adequate backup or safety precautions. Jennifer had actually encountered Bear 341 on 3 separate occasions in March, photographing it from a distance and documenting its movements through her camera trap network, though she had not yet processed all of the images or uploaded them to the shared database that researchers use to track individual animals. She had noted in her field journal that the bear seemed unusually bold and that it was ranging more widely than most bears did at this time of year. But she had not connected these observations to any specific concern about human safety, had not thought to alert the Alaska Department of Fish and Game or to warn the handful of people who lived in the area. Why would she? Bears ranged widely all the time. Bold behavior was not necessarily dangerous behavior, and Jennifer, despite her education and expertise, subscribed to the same philosophy that most bear researchers did, that bears wanted to avoid humans just as much as humans wanted to avoid bears, and that serious conflicts only arose when humans did something stupid like surprise a bear or get between a sow and her cubs or leave food accessible. These 3 people, Thomas Kincaid, Jennifer Yazzie, and Frank Dawson himself, represented the entire human population within a 10-mile radius of the cabin where the events of April 3rd would unfold, and their isolation was both a blessing and a curse. The blessing was that they had chosen to live in one of the most beautiful and wild places left on Earth, a landscape that had changed little since the first humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge 12,000 years ago. A place where the natural world still operated according to its own rules and rhythms without much human interference. The curse was that help, when needed, was far away and hard to summon, that mistakes in this environment tended to be unforgiving, and that the wilderness, beautiful as it was, did not care whether you lived or died. Frank spent the morning of April 1st working on his deck, prying up rotten boards and cutting new ones to fit, losing himself in the familiar rhythm of physical labor, the smell of fresh-cut lumber mixing with the salt air blowing in from the ocean. His hands ached by the time he finished. His back was sore, and he was more tired than he thought he should be from such a simple job. But he felt satisfied with the work, felt like he had accomplished something tangible and useful. He made himself a sandwich for lunch, turkey and cheese on the bread he baked himself once a week, and he ate it standing at his kitchen counter while looking out the window at the mountains, at the peaks still heavy with snow, at the wild country that he had spent his entire adult life exploring and exploiting and ultimately loving with a depth of feeling that he found difficult to articulate even to himself. In the afternoon, he fell asleep in his recliner, the one that Margaret had given him for his 70th birthday, positioning it so he could see both the television and his trophy collection, and he dozed for 2 hours, waking with a start when the wind slammed a loose shutter against the side of the cabin. He felt disoriented for a moment, unsure of the time or the day, a confusion that had been happening more frequently lately and that worried him when he allowed himself to think about it clearly. He checked his watch. 3:47 p.m. He had slept longer than intended. He got up, moving slowly, feeling the stiffness in his joints, and he shuffled into the kitchen to start preparing dinner, even though he wasn't particularly hungry. That evening, after eating a simple meal of canned stew heated on the stove and eating it with more of his homemade bread, Frank sat in his recliner and tried to read a book about the history of Alaska hunting, a thick volume that he had owned for years but had never quite finished. But he found his attention wandering, his eyes drifting from the page to the mounted animals on his walls, and he found himself thinking about the hunts that had produced each trophy, the clients he had guided, the shots that had been fired, the moments of triumph and sometimes tragedy that had defined his career. He thought about the brown bear that had charged him in 1987, remembered the sound it made, a roar that seemed to come from the earth itself, remembered the way time had seemed to slow down as he raised his rifle, remembered the recoil against his shoulder and the smell of gunpowder and the bear collapsing just 15 feet away, close enough that he could see the individual hairs on its muzzle, close enough that if he had hesitated even a fraction of a second, he would have been mauled or killed. He thought about his wife Margaret, about the way she used to sit in the chair next to him in the evenings, knitting or reading or just being present, and he felt the ache of her absence like a physical pain in his chest. 18 months had not been long enough to get used to being alone. He wondered if any amount of time would be long enough. He poured himself his 2 shots of whiskey, Canadian Club that he bought by the case from a liquor store in Kodiak Town, and he drank them slowly, letting the warmth spread through his body, feeling his muscles relax, feeling the edges of his grief soften slightly, though never disappear entirely. At 9:30 p.m., Frank turned off the television, brushed his teeth, changed into his pajamas, and went to bed, pulling the heavy quilts up to his chin, listening to the wind howl around the cabin, hearing the creaks and groans of the structure settling, sounds so familiar after 42 years that they were like a lullaby. He was asleep within minutes, deeply asleep, the sleep of exhaustion and age and whiskey, and he did not hear the sound that came roughly 2 hours later, around 11:45 p.m., the sound of something large moving through the trees behind his cabin, branches snapping under tremendous weight, the sound of claws scraping against bark, the sound of a massive animal investigating his property for the first time, testing his boundaries, learning his vulnerabilities, beginning the process that would end in less than 72 hours with Frank's death. April 2nd, 2025, began much like April 1st, with Frank waking at his usual time, making his usual breakfast, going about his usual routine with the comfortable predictability that characterized the life of an elderly man living alone in the wilderness. But today he felt less energetic than usual, more tired, and he decided to take it easy, to skip the physical labor he had planned, to instead spend the day inside organizing his office and going through some old paperwork that he'd been meaning to sort for months. This decision, small and seemingly insignificant, meant that Frank spent most of the day inside his cabin, unaware that Bear 341 had approached to within 50 yards of his front porch during the early morning hours, emboldened by its previous night's reconnaissance, growing bolder and more curious about this strange territory with its confusing scents and its solitary occupant. The bear had found Frank's garbage, which he kept in a supposedly bear-proof container behind the cabin, and while the container had successfully resisted the bear's attempts to open it, the very existence of the garbage, with its rich smells of food waste and organic matter, had intensified the bear's interest in the property and had solidified the association in the bear's brain between this location and potential food. The bear had also investigated Frank's storage shed, pushing against the door hard enough to bend the hinges, though not hard enough to break them, leaving claw marks in the wood that Frank would never have a chance to see. And the bear had walked around the entire perimeter of the cabin, marking its presence in ways that another bear would have understood as territorial claims, but which Frank, even if he had seen them, would not have recognized for what they were. Inside his office, Frank sorted through decades of hunting photographs, organizing them into albums that he thought Sarah might want someday, though he suspected she would probably just throw them away after he was gone. She had never shared his passion for hunting, had in fact become increasingly uncomfortable with it as she got older, and their relationship had been strained by this fundamental disagreement about something that was central to his identity. Margaret had mediated between them, helping each understand the other's perspective, but without her they had fallen into a pattern of avoiding the topic altogether, which meant avoiding much of what made Frank who he was. He found a photograph of himself from 1994, standing next to the massive Kodiak bear that now dominated his living room wall. His face younger and harder than it was now. His expression a mixture of triumph and something else. Something that looked like fear or respect or perhaps just exhaustion. He remembered that hunt, remembered every detail of it with a clarity that he didn't always have for more recent events. And he remembered the moment when the bear had risen from the alders where it had been feeding on a dead salmon, remembered the way its eyes had locked onto his, remembered knowing with absolute certainty that the bear was going to charge. Remembered the shot that had dropped it, and the way the bear had still tried to get up, still tried to reach him, even with its heart destroyed. Such was its rage and determination. That bear had been defending its food source, asserting its dominance over what it perceived as its territory, and Frank had been intruding whether he acknowledged it or not. The bear had not been evil or malicious. It had simply been doing what bears do, protecting what was theirs, and Frank had killed it for doing so. This was the bargain of hunting, the unspoken agreement that humans and animals made. Humans would enter the animals' world, and sometimes animals would die, and sometimes humans would die, and there was a certain fairness to it, a certain honesty that Frank appreciated even as he recognized that most people in the modern world would find his perspective barbaric or incomprehensible. He had lunch at his desk, another sandwich, and he continued working through the afternoon, making small piles of papers to keep and larger piles to throw away, occasionally finding something that made him laugh or cry. A note from a client, thanking him for the hunt of a lifetime, a letter from Margaret written during one of the rare periods when they had been apart, a photograph of Sarah as a young girl standing next to her first deer, her face beaming with pride while trying to look serious for the camera. By the time he finished, it was after 5 p.m., and the light was fading fast, the way it did in early April in Alaska, the sun setting earlier than it would in summer, but later than in winter, that transitional period where the days grew noticeably longer, week by week, moving toward the endless daylight of the midnight sun. Frank made dinner, grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, comfort food that reminded him of his childhood in Idaho, where he had grown up on a cattle ranch before moving to Alaska in 1969 at the age of 18, seeking adventure and finding it in abundance. After dinner, he tried to call Sarah on the satellite phone that was his primary means of communication with the outside world. But he got her voicemail, which meant she was probably working the night shift at the hospital, so he left a message saying that he was fine, that the weather had been nice for early April, that he loved her and would call again in a few days. He felt guilty as he said it, felt like he was lying, even though technically he was fine, because he wasn't really fine, not in any meaningful sense, and he wondered if Sarah could hear the loneliness in his voice, or if she had grown so accustomed to his stoic independence that she no longer noticed the subtle signs of his decline. That night, Frank had his 2 shots of whiskey, and he went to bed at his usual time, and he slept fitfully, waking several times with leg cramps, with the need to urinate, with vague anxieties that he couldn't quite name, and at 2:17 a.m., according to the clock on his bedside table, he woke to a sound that his sleeping brain had registered as wrong, as dangerous, though his conscious mind took several moments to identify what he had heard. It was a scratching sound, rhythmic and persistent, coming from somewhere outside the cabin, and Frank lay in his bed listening, his heart rate elevated, his breathing shallow, trying to decide whether the sound was something worth investigating or just the wind moving debris around the property. After 5 minutes, the sound stopped, and Frank told himself it was nothing, just branches scraping against the siding, or maybe a small animal, a fox or a marten, nosing around looking for food. He went back to sleep, though not easily, and in the morning he had forgotten about it, or more accurately, he had filed it away in the category of unexplained nighttime noises that were common in the wilderness and usually meaningless. If he had gotten up to investigate, if he had turned on his exterior lights and looked around carefully, He would have seen the fresh claw marks on his storage shed, would have seen the massive paw prints in the soft earth near his front steps, would have seen the clear evidence that a large bear was taking an unusual interest in his property, and he might have taken precautions that could have saved his life. But he didn't investigate, and so he remained ignorant of the danger, and the opportunity to prevent tragedy slipped away like water through cupped hands. April 3rd, 2025, dawned bright and cold, the kind of morning that made Frank happy to be alive and grateful for the life he had built in this place. He woke feeling more rested than he had in days, made his coffee and breakfast, ate while standing at the window watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. It was 9:15 a.m. when he finished breakfast, and he decided that today would be a good day to test his four-wheeler, which had been sitting unused in the storage shed all winter, to make sure it would start and run properly before he needed it for any serious work around the property. He pulled on his boots and his jacket, grabbed his keys from the hook by the door, and walked across the clearing to the storage shed, enjoying the crisp air and the smell of the spruce forest, and the sense of possibility that came with a nice morning. The four-wheeler, a Honda Rancher that he had purchased in 2018, started on the second try, and Frank spent the next hour riding slowly around his property, checking the condition of the trails, noting fallen trees that would need to be cleared, enjoying the simple pleasure of being mobile and competent and in control of his environment. He didn't go far, maybe a mile total, just enough to verify that everything was in working order. And when he got back to the cabin, he felt invigorated, felt younger than he had in months, felt like maybe he did have one more hunt left in him after all. At 11:30 a.m., Frank decided to make soup for lunch, a vegetable soup using canned ingredients that he would eat over the next several days, and he set a large pot on the stove, adding water and vegetables and seasonings, turning the heat to medium-high, and setting a timer on his watch for 30 minutes when he would need to check on it and reduce the heat. But then his satellite phone rang, an uncommon enough occurrence that it startled him, and he answered it to find Raymond Whitmore on the line, his old client from Texas, the one who had been hunting with him since 1989, calling to ask the very question that Frank had been anticipating for weeks. "Frank, how are you doing up there?" Raymond's voice was warm and friendly, the Texas drawl unmistakable even through the digital compression of the satellite connection. "I'm calling because I've been thinking about doing one more bear hunt, maybe in September or October, and I wanted to check if you'd be available to guide me. I know you said you were retiring, but I was hoping you might make an exception for an old friend." Frank sat down at his kitchen table, the phone pressed to his ear, and he felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Pleasure that Raymond would want to hunt with him again, pride that his services were still valued, anxiety about whether he was physically capable of guiding a hunt anymore, and underneath it all a deep sadness that this might truly be his last opportunity to do the thing he had devoted his life to mastering. They talked for 45 minutes, Raymond describing his plan for the hunt, Frank offering advice about timing and locations, both of them falling into the familiar patterns of planning and preparation that they had rehearsed dozens of times over 36 years of hunting together. "I think I can do it," Frank finally said. "One more hunt. But Raymond, I've got to be honest with you. I'm not the man I was even 5 years ago. You'll need to be patient with me. We might not cover as much ground as we used to." "Frank, I don't care about that," Raymond said, and Frank could hear the sincerity in his voice. "I just want to hunt with you one more time. You're the best guide I've ever worked with, and one of my best friends, even though we only see each other once or twice a year. Let's do this thing." They talked for a few more minutes, working out preliminary details, agreeing to firm up the plans over the summer, and when Frank hung up the phone at 12:18 p.m., he felt energized and purposeful in a way he hadn't felt since Margaret's death. He stood up from the table, stretched, smiled to himself, and then he smelled something burning and remembered with a jolt of alarm that he had left soup on the stove. He hurried into the kitchen area of the main room and found the pot boiling over, soup bubbling up and spilling onto the burner, filling the cabin with the acrid smell of burning vegetables and scorched metal. "God damn it!" Frank muttered, turning off the burner and moving the pot to a cool part of the stove, waving his hand to disperse the smoke that had accumulated near the ceiling. The soup was ruined, the bottom of the pot badly burned, and the cabin smelled terrible, the kind of smell that would linger for hours unless he did something about it. He opened the windows in the kitchen area, letting in the cold air, but it wasn't enough. So he walked to the front door, opened it wide, and propped it open with a rubber wedge that he kept for exactly this purpose, creating a cross breeze that would help clear the smoke and smell from the cabin. This decision, made without any thought to its consequences, made in response to a minor domestic inconvenience, would prove to be the final link in the chain of circumstances that led to Frank's death. Because the front door, when propped open, created a direct pathway into the cabin, and the smoke and cooking smells that poured out through that open door carried on the wind directly toward the location where Bear 341 had bedded down roughly 300 yards away in a dense thicket of alders. And those smells, rich with the scent of food and human habitation, triggered something in the bear's brain. A decision matrix that weighed hunger against caution and came down firmly on the side of investigation. Bear 341 had been dozing in the afternoon warmth, having spent the previous night and early morning hours ranging across several miles of territory without finding adequate food, and the bear was becoming desperate in that way that makes animals dangerous. The desperation of extended hunger combined with the biological imperative to build reserves for the next winter, to regain the weight loss during hibernation, to feed the metabolic furnace that drove a 1,300-pound body through the wilderness. The bear lifted its massive head, testing the air, processing the complex information carried by the wind, and then it rose to its feet, shaking itself like a dog shaking off water, and it began moving toward Frank's cabin with the deliberate purpose of a predator that had made a decision. Frank, meanwhile, had returned to the kitchen to assess the damage to his soup pot and to decide whether it was salvageable or whether he would need to throw it away and order a new one from a supply catalogue. He was bent over the sink, scrubbing at the burned residue with steel wool, his back to the open front door, when Bear 341 emerged from the tree line into the clearing around the cabin, the distance between them now less than 200 yards and closing. Frank had his radio playing in the background, a country music station broadcasting from Kodiak town, and the music was loud enough that he wouldn't have heard the bear's approach, even if his hearing had been perfect, and his concentration on his task was complete enough that he wasn't paying attention to his surroundings the way he would have been if he had been in the wilderness rather than inside his own home. The bear crossed the clearing with surprising speed for an animal of its size, moving at a steady walk rather than a run, and it mounted the steps to the deck with a confidence that suggested it had done this before, during its nocturnal visits, and it paused at the open door, its massive head swinging back and forth as it processed the sensory information flooding in from inside the cabin. The smell of smoke and burned food, the smell of human habitation, the smell of preserved animal hides and taxidermy chemicals, and underneath it all, the smell of Frank himself, the sweat and skin and breath of a solitary human who had no idea that death had just arrived at his door. The bear's decision to enter the cabin, when it came, was probably not driven by aggression or predatory intent in the traditional sense, though wildlife behaviorists would debate this point extensively in the aftermath. More likely, the bear was driven by curiosity and hunger, by the learned association between human habitation and food, by the contradictory sensory signals coming from the cabin, by the sheer boldness that comes from being one of the apex predators in an ecosystem where almost nothing poses a threat. The bear's brain, complex in its own way but operating according to different rules than a human brain, processed the information available to it and arrived at a conclusion. This territory contained something worth investigating, and the risk of investigation was acceptable. At 12:31 p.m., while Frank Dawson scrubbed his burned pot at the kitchen sink with the radio playing and his back to the door, Bear 341 entered the cabin through the propped-open front door, its massive body filling the doorframe, its claws clicking on the hardwood floor that Frank had installed himself in 1987, the sound lost beneath the music and the sound of running water and Frank's own low humming as he worked. The bear took 3 steps into the main room, then paused, its attention immediately captured by the taxidermy mounts that covered the walls, by the sight and smell of dozens of preserved animals, by the massive Kodiak bear mount on the north wall that stood in frozen rage, with its paws raised and its mouth open. What happened next, in the space of perhaps 5 seconds, would be reconstructed later through forensic evidence, through the position of Frank's body, through blood spatter analysis, through the damage to the cabin and its contents, through the bear's tracks and the pattern of its movements, but no one would ever know for certain what the bear was thinking or feeling in those moments before the violence began. Did the bear perceive the taxidermy mounts as competitors or threats? Did it feel challenged by the sight of another bear, even a dead one, in what it had come to regard as its territory? Or was the bear simply startled by the unexpected sensory overload, by the sight of so many animals in one place, by the cognitive dissonance between what its eyes saw and what its brain expected? Frank turned from the sink, alerted by some sound or movement, or perhaps just that animal instinct that had kept him alive through 52 years in the wilderness, and he found himself looking across 20 feet of his living room at a massive brown bear standing inside his cabin. And for a moment, a single frozen moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, neither man nor bear moved. Frank's brain struggled to process what he was seeing, struggled to reconcile the impossible sight of a wild bear inside his home with any framework of understanding that made sense. And in that moment of paralysis, that fatal hesitation, the window of opportunity for escape or defense slammed shut. The bear moved first, not charging exactly but moving forward with purpose, closing the distance between them in 3 bounds, and Frank stumbled backward, his legs hitting the kitchen counter, his hands fumbling for something, anything, that might serve as a weapon, finding only the dish towel he had been using to dry his hands. He tried to yell, to make himself bigger and more threatening, the way you were supposed to do with bears, but the sound that came out was thin and weak, the sound of an old man terrified, and the bear kept coming. Frank's last coherent thought, before the bear's first blow struck him and sent him crashing to the floor, with his head bouncing off the cabinet with enough force to fracture his skull, was a thought of profound confusion mixed with something like grief. That he had spent his entire life in the wilderness, had killed dozens of bears, had survived countless dangerous encounters, had done everything right for 74 years. And yet here he was, going to die in his own kitchen with a dish towel in his hands and soup burning on the stove, killed not in some dramatic confrontation in the wild, but in the most mundane of circumstances, victim of his own momentary carelessness in propping open a door. The bear's first strike, a sweeping blow from its right paw with claws extended, caught Frank across the chest and shoulder, tearing through his flannel shirt and the flesh beneath with the ease of paper tearing, opening wounds that went deep enough to scrape bone. And the force of the blow, combined with Frank's backward momentum, sent him to the floor hard enough that his head bounced off the cabinet door with a sound like a melon dropping on concrete. Frank tried to curl into a fetal position, tried to protect his head and vital organs the way he had trained himself to do if ever attacked by a bear. But the confined space of the kitchen made defensive positioning nearly impossible, And besides, he was 74 years old with arthritis and injuries accumulated over a lifetime of hard living, and his body simply could not move fast enough or effectively enough to protect itself. The bear, having made contact, having felt the satisfaction of its claws ripping through flesh and its opponent falling, entered what wildlife behaviorists call a predatory sequence, a pattern of behavior driven by instinct and reinforced by the stimulation of the attack itself. The bear bit down on Frank's left shoulder, its massive jaws closing with enough force to shatter the bones beneath, its canine teeth, each as thick as a man's thumb, punching through muscle and tendon and nerve. And Frank screamed, a sound of agony and terror that might have been heard by anyone nearby, if there had been anyone nearby, but there wasn't. There was only the vast emptiness of the wilderness and the indifferent mountains and the wind in the trees. Frank tried to fight back, his survival instinct overriding the pain, his hands scrabbling for the bear's face, finding fur and flesh but having no strength to do any damage, no leverage to make any difference, and the bear shook him the way a dog shakes a toy, snapping his head back and forth. And Frank felt something tear inside his shoulder, felt tendons ripping and bones grinding, felt the warm spread of blood soaking his shirt and pooling beneath him on the floor. The bear released him, stepped back for a moment, and in that brief respite Frank tried to crawl away, tried to drag himself toward the door, using his one good arm, leaving a streak of blood across the floor. But the bear pounced again, landing on his back with its full weight, crushing the air from his lungs, probably cracking several ribs, and Frank couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything except feel the pressure and pain and know with absolute certainty that he was dying. The attack lasted approximately 4 minutes, though to Frank it must have felt much longer. And by the time the bear finally stopped, having satisfied whatever need or instinct had driven it to violence, Frank was barely conscious, his body broken in dozens of places, his blood spreading across the floor of his cabin in a pool that would eventually cover more than 30 square feet. The bear stood over him for perhaps 30 seconds, breathing heavily, its muzzle stained with Frank's blood. And then it did something that would puzzle investigators and behaviorists when they eventually reconstructed the scene. Instead of feeding on Frank, instead of consuming the meat that it had killed, the bear simply turned away and began investigating the rest of the cabin, moving from room to room with apparent curiosity, occasionally swatting at taxidermy mounts or knocking objects off shelves, but showing no particular rage or destructiveness beyond what was necessary to satisfy its curiosity. In the main room, the bear approached the massive Kodiak bear mount on the north wall, the 11-foot-tall specimen that had been Frank's pride and joy, and the bear reared up on its hind legs, matching the mount's posture. And for a moment, the two bears, one living and one dead, stood facing each other in what might have been a territorial display or might have been simple investigation. Then the living bear reached out with one paw and pulled at the mount, testing it, and the mount, which had been attached to the wall with bolts that had held for 31 years, tore free with a screech of metal and a cascade of plaster dust, and the bear jumped back, startled by the noise and movement, then approached again and began systematically destroying the mount, ripping the hide from the form, tearing out the glass eyes, reducing Frank's most prized trophy to an unrecognizable pile of fur and foam and wire. Over the next 30 minutes, while Frank lay dying on his kitchen floor, drifting in and out of consciousness, unable to move or call for help, Bear 341 moved through the cabin, destroying nearly every taxidermy mount within reach. The brown bear was pulled from its pedestal and torn apart. The Dall sheep was knocked from the wall and trampled. The moose head was clawed down, its massive rack becoming separated from the mount and clattering across the floor. The wolverine, the lynx, the foxes, the birds, all were destroyed with what seemed like systematic thoroughness, as if the bear were eliminating competitors, clearing the territory of rivals, asserting dominance over every potential threat, whether living or dead or somewhere in between. The total value of the taxidermy destroyed would later be estimated at approximately $214,000, representing not just monetary loss, but the destruction of Frank's entire professional legacy. Every trophy from every successful hunt reduced to torn hide and broken bones and scattered stuffing. But Frank, lying on the floor in a spreading pool of his own blood, was beyond caring about such things. He was dying slowly from blood loss and shock and trauma, his mind retreating to memories as consciousness faded. Margaret's face on their wedding day, Sarah as a baby in his arms, the mountains of Alaska seen for the first time from the deck of a ferry in 1969, the feel of a rifle in his hands, the smell of coffee brewing, 1,000 small moments that had added up to a life, not a perfect life, but his life. And now it was ending here, alone, mauled by a bear in his own home, and there was a certain terrible poetry to it that Frank might have appreciated if he had been capable of appreciating anything. At 1:07 p.m., after 36 minutes in the cabin, Bear 341 exited through the still-open front door, leaving behind carnage and destruction, leaving behind Frank Dawson bleeding and dying on his kitchen floor, but still, incredibly, alive. The bear crossed the deck, descended the steps, and disappeared into the forest, moving south at a steady walk, and the clearing around the cabin fell silent, except for the wind in the trees and the continued playing of Frank's radio in the background, a cheerful country song about trucks and beer and good times that seemed obscene in the context of what had just happened. Frank remained conscious for another 12 minutes, though his awareness was fragmentary and confused, brief moments of clarity alternating with longer periods of delirium. He understood that he was badly hurt. He understood that he needed help. He tried to move, to reach for his satellite phone that sat on the kitchen counter 8 feet away, but his body would not respond to his commands. His left arm completely useless, his right arm too weak to lift his weight, his legs unable to find purchase on the blood-slicked floor. He managed to turn his head slightly to see through the open door into the main room where his trophies had hung, and he saw the destruction, saw the torn hides and broken mounts and scattered debris, and he felt a sense of loss that was almost greater than his fear of death. Felt like something essential had been taken from him, his legacy destroyed, his life's work reduced to garbage. His last conscious thought, at approximately 1:19 p.m. on April 3rd, 2025, was a memory of Margaret, specifically a memory from the summer of 1984, when they had sat on the deck of this cabin that they had just finished building, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and pink and purple. And Margaret had taken his hand and said, "We did something good here, Frank. We built something that will last." And Frank, drifting into unconsciousness for the final time, thought with profound sadness that she had been wrong, that nothing lasted, that everything they had built could be destroyed by a single bear in a single afternoon, that permanence was an illusion and that the wilderness always won in the end. Frank's heart continued beating for another 3 hours and 41 minutes, pumping blood through his damaged circulatory system, spreading the blood pool wider and wider across the kitchen floor. But he was not conscious for any of that time. His brain shut down by trauma and blood loss and shock, mercifully sparing him the experience of his own prolonged dying. His heart finally stopped at 5 p.m. The exact time would be estimated later through forensic analysis of blood clotting and lividity patterns, and Frank Joseph Dawson, 74 years old, retired guide, husband of Margaret, father of Sarah, resident of Kodiak Island for 56 years, ceased to exist as a living being and became instead a body evidence, a tragedy to be investigated and explained and mourned. But no one knew this yet. No one knew that Frank was dead. The world continued spinning, people went about their lives, and Frank's body lay undiscovered on his kitchen floor, with the front door still propped open, and the wind blowing through the cabin, and the radio still playing its cheerful songs. And it would be nearly 18 hours before anyone came looking for him. 18 hours during which the crime scene, such as it was, would be further contaminated by weather and wildlife. 18 hours during which Sarah Brennan continued her nursing shift in Anchorage, completely unaware that her father was dead. 18 hours during which Bear 341 moved deeper into the wilderness, carrying with it the scent of Frank's blood and the memory of easy entry into a human dwelling and a lesson about vulnerability that would make it more dangerous to the next person it encountered. Thomas Kincaid, Frank's closest neighbor, was the first person to notice that something might be wrong, though even he didn't immediately recognize it as an emergency. Thomas had been working around his cabin all day on April 3rd, cleaning and preparing for his wife's arrival, and at 4 p.m. he had tried to raise Frank on the radio for their semi-regular check-in, just a quick conversation to verify that both of them were okay, and to exchange information about weather or wildlife or whatever else seemed worth discussing. When Frank didn't answer, Thomas thought nothing of it. Frank didn't always answer, especially if he was working outside or if he had decided to take a nap, and Thomas simply made a mental note to try again later. But when Thomas tried again at 7 p.m. and then again at 9 p.m. with no response either time, he began to feel the first stirrings of concern, not acute worry, but a vague uneasiness that something might be wrong. Frank was usually pretty good about monitoring the radio, and 3 missed check-ins in a row was unusual. Thomas stood on his own deck, looking north toward the area where Frank's cabin lay, hidden by miles of forest and hills, and he debated whether he should drive over to check on his neighbor or whether he was being overly cautious and bothering an old man who simply wanted to be left alone. The problem was that it was now full dark, and the road between their properties was rough and potentially dangerous at night, and Thomas had been drinking. Not much, but enough that he didn't feel comfortable driving, and besides, what if Frank was fine, and Thomas showed up in the middle of the night, looking foolish and intrusive? Thomas decided to wait until morning, a decision he would second-guess and regret for years to come, and he went to bed telling himself that Frank was probably fine, that he was worrying for nothing, that he would try the radio first thing in the morning and get an answer, and feel silly for having worried at all. But Thomas slept poorly, waking repeatedly with a sense of unease that he couldn't quite shake, and he was up at 5:30 a.m. on April 4th, well before dawn, making coffee and trying Frank's radio every 15 minutes starting at 6 a.m. by 8 a.m. With no response to 5 separate radio calls, Thomas was genuinely worried, and he made the decision to drive to Frank's cabin to check on him, a decision complicated by the fact that he had promised his wife he would pick her up at the airport in Kodiak Town at 2 p.m., and didn't want to be late or to worry her. He threw together a quick breakfast, loaded his truck with basic safety gear including a rifle, a first aid kit, a satellite phone, and a handheld radio. And at 8:37 a.m. he began the drive to Frank's property, following the rough gravel road that wound through the forest, splashing through mud puddles and bumping over ruts, traveling at a cautious 15 miles per hour on a route that covered roughly 4 miles as the crow flies, but closer to 7 miles by road. The morning was overcast and cold, with a light drizzle that made everything grey and dreary, and Thomas drove with his windshield wipers on intermittent, peering ahead at the road, occasionally glancing into the forest on either side, where he could see almost nothing through the dense growth of spruce and alder. He encountered no other vehicles, no other people. This was remote country even by Alaska standards, and traffic on this road might consist of 1 or 2 vehicles per week during the off-season. Thomas had his radio on, and tried several more times to raise Frank without success, and with each failed attempt, his anxiety increased, his imagination beginning to supply scenarios to explain Frank's silence. Heart attack, stroke, fall, any of the medical emergencies that became more likely with age and isolation. Thomas reached the turnoff to Frank's property at 9:14 a.m. and followed the driveway, more of a pair of ruts than an actual drive, the final 600 yards to the cabin. And as the cabin came into view through the trees, he immediately noticed that something was wrong. The front door was standing open, unusual given the cold weather, and there were no lights on inside despite the gloom of the overcast morning, and Frank's four-wheeler was parked outside the storage shed in a position that suggested it had been used recently, all details that individually might have innocent explanations, but which collectively suggested a situation that was abnormal. Thomas parked his truck 30 yards from the cabin, positioning it so he could leave quickly if necessary, a precaution born of decades of experience in the wilderness. And he sat for a moment, looking at the scene, trying to decide on his best course of action. He didn't see Frank anywhere. He didn't see any obvious signs of trouble, but the open door bothered him, and the lack of response to repeated radio calls bothered him, and the general sense that something was off bothered him. Thomas grabbed his rifle, a .338 Winchester Magnum that he kept loaded and ready for exactly this kind of situation, and he exited his truck, closing the door quietly, and he began walking slowly toward the cabin, his eyes scanning the clearing and the tree line, looking for threats, looking for Frank, looking for anything that might explain the situation. He mounted the steps to the deck, his boots making hollow sounds on the wood, and he called out, "Frank? Frank, are you here? It's Thomas Kincaid. I tried you on the radio and got no answer. Just checking to make sure you're okay." His voice sounded too loud in the morning quiet, and he paused, listening, hearing nothing except the wind and the distant sound of a raven calling. He called again, louder this time. "Frank! Can you hear me?" Still nothing. Thomas reached the open doorway and stopped, his heart rate elevated, his senses alert, and he looked into the dim interior of the cabin and saw, even in the poor light, that something terrible had happened. The main room was destroyed, taxidermy mounts torn down and scattered, furniture overturned, debris everywhere, and there was a smell, an organic smell that Thomas recognized even though he had never smelled it before, in quite this context, the smell of blood and death and violence. He raised his rifle, thumbing off the safety, and he stepped into the cabin, moving slowly, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior, and he called out again, "Frank? Jesus Christ, Frank, what happened here?" He moved into the main room, stepping carefully around the debris, seeing the destroyed trophies, seeing the massive Kodiak bear mount reduced to a pile of torn hide, seeing claw marks on the walls and floor, and his mind began to process what he was seeing, began to arrive at the only explanation that made sense, even though it seemed impossible. A bear had been inside this cabin, a bear had destroyed this room, and if a bear had been here, then where was Frank? Thomas felt a cold dread settling into his stomach, a certainty that he was about to find something terrible, and he moved toward the kitchen area, toward the source of the blood smell. And then he saw the blood on the floor, an enormous pool of it, dark and dried but unmistakably blood. And he saw the body lying in that blood, recognizably human even though Thomas's mind momentarily refused to accept what his eyes were showing him. "Oh, God," Thomas whispered. "Oh, Jesus, God." He moved closer, still holding his rifle, still scanning the cabin for threats, even though it was obvious the bear was long gone. And he looked down at Frank's body and saw the extent of the damage, the torn flesh, the unnatural angles of broken bones, the blood everywhere, and Thomas knew without having to check for a pulse that Frank was dead, had been dead for hours, maybe since yesterday, and Thomas felt his stomach heave and he turned away and vomited on Frank's floor, adding his own biological matter to the crime scene, contaminating the evidence, though he couldn't have known that was what he was doing and wouldn't have cared if he had. Thomas stumbled out of the cabin onto the deck, breathing hard, his hands shaking, his mind racing. He needed to call this in. He needed to contact the authorities. He needed to do something. But for a moment he simply stood there, bent over with his hands on his knees, trying to process what he had just seen, trying to reconcile the horror inside that cabin with his understanding of the world. Thomas had lived in Alaska for 24 years. He had seen plenty of death, had seen animals killed by predators, had seen the results of hunting accidents, but he had never seen anything like this. The violence of it, the destruction, the sheer carnage of a bear attack on a human in an enclosed space. He forced himself to calm down, to think clearly, to do what needed to be done. He pulled his satellite phone from his jacket pocket and dialed 911, and after a few seconds of connection time, he heard a dispatcher's voice, calm and professional, asking about his emergency. Thomas tried to explain what he had found, tried to describe the situation, but his words came out jumbled and disconnected. My neighbor. There's been an attack. A bear. He's dead. Frank Dawson, Carlick Road, his cabin. Oh God, there's so much blood. The dispatcher, a woman named Jennifer Moss, who worked for the Alaska State Troopers Dispatch Center in Kodiak Town, took control of the conversation with practiced efficiency. Sir, I need you to calm down and speak slowly. You said someone is dead? Can you confirm that the person is deceased? Have you checked for a pulse? Thomas took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. I didn't check for a pulse, but I'm sure he's dead. He's been... the body. There's massive trauma. A bear attacked him. Inside his cabin. I think it happened yesterday. Okay, sir. I'm dispatching help to your location right now. Can you give me the exact address? Thomas provided the information, the mile marker on Carlick Road and the directions to Frank's property, and Jennifer Moss typed rapidly, entering the details into her computer, flagging the incident as a probable wildlife attack with one confirmed fatality, a code that would trigger a specific response protocol involving state troopers, wildlife officers, and potentially search and rescue personnel, depending on the circumstances. She kept Thomas on the line, asking questions, verifying information, making sure he was safe, making sure there was no immediate threat, and Thomas stood on Frank's deck looking out at the forest and answering her questions while a part of his mind kept returning to the image of Frank's body on the kitchen floor, the image that he knew would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Alaska State Troopers post in Kodiak Town received the dispatch at 9:27 a.m., and Trooper Daniel Velasquez, a 12-year veteran of the Alaska State Troopers who served as the senior field trooper for the western Kodiak Island region, was sitting at his desk working on paperwork when the call came through. Daniel was 41 years old, originally from California, but an Alaska resident for 15 years, and he had responded to dozens of wilderness incidents during his career, including several bear attacks, though never one quite like this. An attack inside a residence. He grabbed his gear, alerted his partner Trooper Melissa Chang, who was younger and less experienced, but sharp and capable, and they loaded up their vehicle, a specially equipped four-wheel drive Chevrolet Tahoe that served as their mobile office and carried everything they might need for backcountry work. Daniel also called Eli Thompson, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game wildlife technician who covered this region, because any incident involving wildlife required fish and game involvement, and Eli answered on the second ring, listening carefully as Daniel briefed him on the situation. Eli was 38 years old, a wildlife biologist who had worked for Fish and Game for 11 years, and his job included everything from population surveys to human-wildlife conflict resolution to, occasionally, investigating attacks like this one. Eli said he would meet them at the scene, and he began loading his own truck with the specialized equipment he might need. cameras, sample collection kits, measuring tools, rifles, ammunition, and the various other implements of wildlife investigation. The drive to Frank's cabin would take approximately 50 minutes from Kodiak town, longer if conditions were bad, and as Daniel and Melissa headed west on the Chiniak Road before turning onto the Karluk Road, Daniel used the time to brief Melissa on what they were likely to find and what their priorities would be. First, they would secure the scene and verify the fatality. Second, they would assess whether there was any ongoing threat from the bear. Third, they would document everything thoroughly, because this would be a complex investigation involving multiple agencies and potentially significant media attention. Fourth, they would need to notify next of kin, and Daniel pulled up Frank's file on the mobile data terminal and found the contact information for Sarah Brennan in Anchorage. "This is going to be rough," Daniel told Melissa as they drove. "Bear attacks are always difficult, always emotionally intense, and when it happens inside someone's home, it's even worse. The violence of it, the invasion of a space that's supposed to be safe, it messes with people's heads. We need to be professional, but we also need to be human about this." Melissa nodded, making notes, and she had her own thoughts about what they were going to find, having read plenty of case files about bear attacks during her training, having seen the photographs that documented the damage that bears could inflict on human bodies. She was nervous, but also grimly determined to do her job well, to honor the victim by investigating his death thoroughly and competently. She was thinking about Frank, about who he had been, about the life that had been ended, and she was thinking about his family, about the people who would have to be told that their loved one was dead, killed in one of the most horrible ways imaginable. They reached Thomas Kincaid's location at 10:19 a.m., pulling up beside his truck where Thomas sat waiting for them, still shaken but calmer than he had been an hour ago, and Daniel and Melissa exited their vehicle and introduced themselves. And Daniel asked Thomas to describe exactly what he had found, what he had seen, what he had touched, and Thomas walked them through it while they took notes. Then Daniel asked Thomas to wait by his truck, to not re-enter the cabin, and Daniel and Melissa approached the scene with their weapons drawn, not because they expected the bear to still be present, but because you could never be completely sure, and caution was always better than regret. Daniel entered the cabin first, Melissa following close behind, and even though Thomas had described what they would find, the reality of it was still shocking. The destroyed room, the blood, the body. Daniel holstered his weapon and knelt beside Frank's body, checking for a pulse, even though it was obviously unnecessary, confirming time of death as sometime the previous day based on the condition of the body and the blood. He photographed the body from multiple angles, documented the wounds, noted the position and condition of everything around the body, working methodically, professionally, pushing aside his emotional reactions to focus on the evidence. Melissa documented the rest of the cabin, photographing the destroyed taxidermy, the claw marks, the overturned furniture, creating a visual record that would be essential for the investigation. She estimated that it would take hours, maybe days, to properly document and process this scene, and she wondered aloud whether they should call in additional resources, maybe crime scene specialists from Anchorage, maybe bear behavior experts, maybe whoever could help them make sense of this situation. Eli Thompson arrived at 10:47 a.m., bringing with him the perspective of someone who had spent his entire professional life studying and managing bears, and after conferring briefly with Daniel and Melissa, he entered the cabin to conduct his own assessment. Eli had investigated bear attacks before, had seen the damage that bears could do, but this scene disturbed him in ways that he found difficult to articulate. The destruction of the taxidermy mounts suggested something beyond simple predation or even defensive aggression. It suggested a level of intentionality that made Eli uncomfortable, because bears were not supposed to be intentional in that way. They were supposed to operate according to instinct and stimulus response patterns, and what he was seeing suggested something more complex. Eli examined the tracks and sign that the bear had left throughout the cabin, photographed them, took measurements, and based on the size of the prints and the height of claw marks on the walls, he estimated that they were dealing with a very large male Kodiak bear, probably in the 800 to 1,300-pound range, and he began pulling together a profile of the animal that would help them determine whether they could identify it and track it. He swabbed several areas where the bear had left saliva or other biological material, collecting DNA samples that could be compared against the database that Alaska Fish and Game maintained on known problem bears, and he found himself hoping that this bear was already in the system, because that would make it easier to locate and deal with. By noon, the cabin was swarming with personnel, including not just the original responders, but additional state troopers, a medical examiner's investigator who had flown in from Anchorage, a forensic photographer, and several other specialists. The investigation was being treated as both a wildlife incident and a potential crime scene. Not because anyone suspected foul play by humans, but because the evidence needed to be collected to the same standard as any suspicious death. Frank's body would need to be removed and transported to Anchorage for a full autopsy. The cabin would need to be processed thoroughly. The bear would need to be tracked and most likely destroyed, because the standard policy in Alaska was that bears that killed humans were not relocated or given second chances. They were put down, both as punishment and as a preventive measure to ensure they didn't kill again. Daniel Velasquez had the unpleasant task of notifying next of kin, and at 12:34 p.m. he placed a call to Sarah Brennan's cell phone, reaching her at Alaska Regional Hospital, where she was just finishing a 12-hour night shift. Sarah answered tiredly, expecting maybe a wrong number or a spam call, not expecting a state trooper to identify himself and ask if she was the daughter of Frank Dawson. And when she said yes, when she heard the tone in Daniel's voice and the careful way he asked if she was sitting down and if there was someone with her, she knew immediately that something terrible had happened. "Ms. Brennan, I'm very sorry to have to tell you this, but your father has been killed. There was an incident at his cabin yesterday, a bear attack, and he died from his injuries. I'm so very sorry for your loss." Sarah's response was silence, a long silence during which Daniel could hear her breathing, could almost hear her trying to process the information, trying to make it make sense, and then she made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob, and then she said, "No. No, that's not. He's fine. I talked to him 2 days ago. He was fine." Daniel, who had delivered this kind of news too many times during his career, who had seen every possible reaction from denial to rage to collapse, spoke gently but firmly, giving Sarah the information she needed while trying to spare her the worst details, telling her that Frank appeared to have died quickly, that he probably didn't suffer long, small mercies that might or might not have been true, but which seemed important to offer. He told her that her father's body would be transported to Anchorage for examination and that she could see him at the medical examiner's office if she wanted to, though Daniel did not tell her that the extent of Frank's injuries might make that viewing extremely difficult. Sarah asked the questions that people always asked in these situations. What happened? Why? How? Could it have been prevented? Was he alone? Did he die quickly? And Daniel answered as best he could, telling her what they knew and what they didn't know, telling her that the investigation was ongoing, telling her that they would find the bear and deal with it. Though that last part provided no comfort, because Sarah didn't care about the bear, didn't care about revenge or justice or any of the things that Daniel thought might matter to her. She only cared that her father was dead, that she would never talk to him again, that she had lost the last of her parents, and she felt a grief so profound that she couldn't speak, couldn't think, could only sit in the hospital break room where she had taken the call and cry while Daniel stayed on the line, staying with her even though he had other calls to make and other tasks to perform, because staying with her in this moment felt like the right thing to do, the human thing, and Daniel had not been a cop long enough to forget how to be human. By mid-afternoon on April 4th, news of Frank's death had begun to spread through the small community of people who lived in the western Kodiak area and who knew Frank or knew of him. And the response was shock mixed with something like fear, because if a bear could attack someone like Frank, someone who had lived in the wilderness his entire adult life and who knew bears as well as anyone, then who was safe? People checked their locks, looked at their windows, thought about their own vulnerability in ways they hadn't before. The guides and outfitters, Frank's professional colleagues, heard the news with particular distress because Frank had been one of them, part of the fraternity of people who made their living from the wilderness. And if Frank could be killed like this, then none of them were safe. Their expertise and experience meant nothing. The wilderness had reminded them that they were still prey. Thomas Kincaid gave his statement to the troopers, describing what he had found and when, and then he drove back to his cabin. And called his wife to tell her not to come, that something had happened, that he needed time to process it before she arrived. And Diane was confused and worried, but she agreed to postpone her flight, and Thomas spent the afternoon sitting on his deck, drinking whiskey straight from the bottle and replaying the scene in his mind over and over, the blood, the body, the destruction. And he wondered whether he could have saved Frank if he had gone over the night before instead of waiting until morning. Wondered whether those extra hours would have made a difference, knowing rationally that they wouldn't have, that Frank had probably died within an hour or two of the attack, but torturing himself with the what-ifs anyway, because that's what humans do in the aftermath of tragedy. Jennifer Yazzie, the wildlife researcher, heard about the attack from Eli Thompson, who called her because he wanted to know if she had any recent information about bear activity in the area, and when Eli described the location of the attack and the estimated timeline, Jennifer felt a cold shock of recognition because she realized that the bear involved might be the same large male she had been photographing and tracking, the one she had noted as being unusually bold. She told Eli about her observations, offered to share her photographs and camera trap data, and she felt a crushing sense of guilt that she hadn't reported her concerns to anyone, hadn't warned Frank or Thomas or anyone else that there was a potentially dangerous bear operating in their area. She knew rationally that she couldn't have predicted this, that thousands of bear encounters happened every year without violence, that the odds of any particular bear attacking any particular human were vanishingly small, but she felt responsible anyway, felt like she had failed in her duty to protect both the bears she studied and the humans who lived among them. The media learned about the attack by late afternoon on April 4th, initially through the police scanner traffic that reporters monitoring emergency services channels picked up, and by evening the story was being reported on local news in Anchorage and Kodiak, with headlines like "Retired Guide Killed in Cabin Bear Attack" and "Kodiak Man Dies in Home Invasion by Brown Bear." The initial reports were respectful and accurate, focusing on the basic facts while withholding Frank's name pending family notification. But as the story gained traction and moved from local to state to eventually national news, the coverage became more sensational, with headlines emphasizing the horror and unusualness of the attack, the destruction of the taxidermy collection, the irony of a hunting guide killed by the animals he had spent his life hunting. By April 5th, the story had gone viral on social media, with people sharing articles and offering opinions and expressing horror and sympathy, and occasionally making jokes or political points about hunting and conservation and animal rights. The usual chaos that attends any story that touches on contentious issues. Some people saw Frank's death as tragic and random. Others saw it as karmic justice. A hunter killed by his prey, the universe balancing the books. Animal rights activists pointed to the story as evidence that hunting was cruel and that wild animals had a right to defend their territory. Hunting advocates argued that the attack had nothing to do with hunting and everything to do with an individual bear behaving abnormally. The debate raged online while Frank's body lay in a morgue in Anchorage, and his daughter tried to make funeral arrangements, and his cabin remained sealed as a crime scene. The search for Bear 341 began on the afternoon of April 4th, with Eli Thompson coordinating a team that included fish and game personnel, local guides with bear tracking experience, and state troopers providing security and support. They started at Frank's cabin, following the bear's tracks from the scene into the forest, documenting every print and sign, building a trail that would allow them to pursue the animal systematically. The tracks led south and east into dense country that was difficult to traverse, and the team moved slowly and carefully, aware that they were pursuing one of the most dangerous predators in North America, and that the bear, having killed a human, might be particularly aggressive if cornered. The search was hampered by weather, by the difficult terrain, and by the simple vastness of the search area. Kodiak Island encompasses more than 3,000 square miles, much of it roadless wilderness, and a single bear could be anywhere within hundreds of square miles of territory, moving constantly, leaving minimal sign, effectively invisible in the dense forest. The team deployed helicopters to conduct aerial surveys, set up camera traps at likely crossing points, consulted with Jennifer Yazzie about the bear's known movement patterns, and still they found nothing concrete. The bear had seemingly vanished into the wilderness, and with each passing day the likelihood of locating it decreased, the trail growing colder, the bear moving farther away, or perhaps not moving at all, perhaps bedded down somewhere waiting for the search to give up. Frank's autopsy was performed on April 6th by Dr. Karen Lindstrom, the Alaska State Medical Examiner, a woman who had seen plenty of violent deaths during her 23-year career, but who still found bear attack victims uniquely disturbing because of the nature of the injuries. Dr. Lindstrom's autopsy report, which would eventually run to 47 pages of detailed documentation, described the extensive trauma that Frank had suffered. Severe lacerations to the chest, shoulder and arms consistent with large claws. Puncture wounds to the left shoulder consistent with large canine teeth. Compound fractures of the left clavicle, humerus, and several ribs. Skull fracture resulting from impact with a hard surface. And ultimately cause of death determined to be exsanguination and hypovolemic shock, secondary to severe tissue trauma. Dr. Lindstrom noted in her report that Frank had probably been conscious for at least several minutes after the attack began, meaning he had been aware of what was happening to him, aware that he was being mauled, aware that he was dying, and this observation, clinical and necessary for the medical record, was also deeply disturbing to Sarah when she read the report weeks later. The idea that her father had suffered, had known what was happening, had died in terror and pain rather than quickly and mercifully. The autopsy report also noted evidence of chronic health conditions, including moderate to severe arthritis, early-stage heart disease, and cirrhosis, suggesting long-term alcohol consumption. Details that painted a picture of a man who had been declining physically, who might have been less capable of responding to the attack than he would have been even a few years earlier. Sarah Brennan spent the days following her father's death in a fog of grief and practicality, trying to handle all the necessary tasks while simultaneously trying to process the emotional reality of her loss. She flew to Kodiak with her husband David on April 7th, and they drove out to Frank's cabin, which was still an active investigation site, but which the troopers allowed them to visit briefly, and Sarah stood in her father's cabin, surrounded by the destruction and the bloodstains and the emptiness, and she tried to understand how this had happened, tried to make sense of it, tried to find meaning or purpose or some kind of narrative that would make her father's death less random and senseless. But there was no meaning, no purpose, no narrative beyond the simple fact that a bear had entered a cabin and killed a man, an event so random and unlikely that it seemed almost cosmically unfair. David walked through the cabin taking photographs for insurance purposes, documenting the destroyed taxidermy, and he estimated that even with insurance, the financial loss would be substantial, possibly ruinous if the policy didn't cover wildlife damage or if the value of the collection exceeded the coverage limits. But Sarah didn't care about the money or the trophies. She cared about the fact that her father's entire life, his legacy, his achievements, everything he had worked for, had been destroyed by a single bear in a single afternoon, reduced to literal garbage, as if his life had meant nothing, as if all those years of work and expertise and success had been erased in minutes. They returned to Kodiak Town that evening, and Sarah began the process of planning her father's funeral, making decisions about burial versus cremation. She chose cremation because Frank had once mentioned preferring it, though they had never had an actual conversation about his wishes. Selecting a funeral home, writing an obituary, notifying Frank's friends and former clients, handling all the mundane details that death requires, even as her heart was breaking. She was angry, she realized, angry at her father for being careless, for leaving the door open, for not being more careful in his old age. Angry at herself for not visiting more often, for not insisting harder that he move to Anchorage, for not being there when he needed her. Angry at the bear for existing, for being hungry, for making the choices that led to her father's death. Angry at the universe for allowing something so horrible to happen to someone who had lived his life competently and carefully and who deserved better than to die bleeding on his kitchen floor. The memorial service was held on April 12th at a funeral home in Kodiak Town, and nearly 200 people attended, a testament to Frank's long career and the respect he had earned over decades of guiding. Sarah was surprised by the turnout, had not realized how many people her father had touched, how many lives he had influenced, and she heard story after story from former clients who described him as the best guide they had ever worked with, as a man of integrity and skill, as someone who had given them experiences they would never forget. Raymond Whitmore flew in from Texas specifically for the service, and he hugged Sarah and told her that Frank had been like a second father to him, and Sarah felt grateful for his kindness, even as she thought about the last conversation her father had had, the conversation about one more hunt, the conversation that had probably been playing through Frank's mind as he died. The service included a slideshow of photographs from Frank's life, images of him as a young man arriving in Alaska, as a husband with Margaret, as a father with Sarah, as a guide with countless clients and countless trophies, as an old man still vital and engaged with the wilderness he loved. The images told the story of a life fully lived, a life of adventure and accomplishment and love. And Sarah looked at those images and tried to hold on to the good memories, tried not to let the horror of his death overwhelm everything that had come before, though she knew that the way he died would forever color the way she remembered him. In the weeks following the funeral, the investigation into Frank's death continued, though it had largely moved from active pursuit to documentation and analysis. The bear was never found, never conclusively identified, though DNA analysis of the samples collected from the cabin was compared against the known bear database and returned a match to an animal that had been involved in several previous incidents of human-wildlife conflict in the area, confirming Eli Thompson's suspicion that they were dealing with a repeat offender, a bear that had learned bad habits and had finally escalated to the worst possible outcome. Alaska Department of Fish and Game held an internal review of the incident, examining whether there were policy failures or missed opportunities that might have prevented Frank's death. And while the review found no specific policy violations or negligent decisions, it did recommend several changes to how problem bears were managed, including lower thresholds for lethal action, increased public education efforts, and better coordination between different agencies and stakeholders. Patricia Valdez, the supervisor who had overruled the recommendation to destroy Bear 341 in 2023, did not face any formal discipline, but she carried a burden of guilt that affected her work and her personal life, and she eventually requested a transfer to a different position where she didn't have to make life or death decisions about wildlife management. Jennifer Yazzie completed her doctoral dissertation in late 2025, and while it was well received by her committee and contributed important knowledge to the field of bear behavior, she found that her passion for the work had been diminished by Frank's death, by the knowledge that the bears she studied and advocated for were not the benign symbols of wilderness that the public often imagined them to be, but were instead apex predators capable of horrific violence under the right circumstances. She accepted a teaching position at a university in the lower 48 states, leaving Alaska and the bears behind, seeking distance from the guilt and sadness that had become associated with her research. Thomas Kincaid never returned to his cabin after April 4th, unable to face the place knowing what had happened so close by, unable to enjoy the wilderness that had always been his refuge now that it had been revealed as dangerous in a way he had never fully appreciated before. He sold the property in late 2025 to a couple from California who had no knowledge of the Dawson attack and no particular concerns about bears, and Thomas and his wife Diane stayed in Oregon, where the most dangerous wildlife they encountered were coyotes and the occasional black bear, nothing like the massive predators that ruled the forests of Kodiak Island. Sarah Brennan returned to Kodiak Island only once more after her father's funeral in late summer of 2025 to close out his estate and prepare the cabin for sale. She spent 3 days there, cleaning and organizing, sorting through her father's possessions, deciding what to keep and what to discard, and she found the work therapeutic in a way, a final act of care for her father, a way of honoring his life by treating his belongings with respect. She kept some of his clothing, some photographs, his hunting journals, and a few small personal items that she thought her children might want someday as remembrances of their grandfather. Everything else, including what remained of the taxidermy collection, she sold or donated or threw away, wanting nothing to do with the trophies that had been at the center of her father's life, and that had, in some obscure way, contributed to his death. The cabin itself sold quickly to a young couple from Anchorage who wanted a remote retreat and who were willing to accept the property's dark history in exchange for a reduced price. Sarah never met them, handled the entire transaction through a real estate agent, and she felt relieved when the sale closed and she no longer had any legal or financial connection to the place where her father had died. She used the proceeds from the sale to fund college savings accounts for her children, a practical decision that felt right, felt like something her father would have approved of, turning the wilderness property into an investment in the future. The psychological aftermath of Frank's death extended far beyond his immediate family, affecting everyone who had been touched by the incident in ways both obvious and subtle. Daniel Velasquez, the state trooper who had led the initial investigation, found himself having nightmares about the scene, about the blood and the body and the destroyed trophies, and he eventually sought counseling through his department's employee assistance program, talking through his reactions with a therapist who specialized in trauma, learning coping strategies that helped him process what he had witnessed. Melissa Chang, his partner, had a different reaction, becoming hypervigilant about bear safety, carrying bear spray and a large caliber handgun whenever she was in the field, unable to relax in the wilderness in the way she had before, the innocence of her relationship with nature permanently damaged by exposure to its violence. Eli Thompson threw himself into his work with increased intensity, becoming a leading advocate for aggressive management of problem bears and for public education about bear safety, giving talks at community centers and schools and hunting lodges, emphasizing that bears were dangerous, that they deserved respect and caution, that the comfortable narrative of peaceful coexistence between humans and wildlife was oversimplified and sometimes deadly. He thought about Frank often, thought about whether there was anything he or Fish and Game could have done differently that might have prevented the attack, and while he never arrived at a satisfactory answer, the question haunted him and motivated him to do better, to be more proactive, to err on the side of caution when it came to protecting human life, even if that meant being less protective of individual bears. The hunting community in Alaska and beyond reacted to Frank's death with a complex mixture of grief, anger, and defensiveness, feeling attacked by the media coverage that seemed to suggest that Frank had somehow deserved what happened, that his death was karmic justice for a lifetime of killing animals. Hunting advocacy groups published editorials and gave interviews emphasizing that Frank had been a conservation-minded sportsman who had contributed to wildlife management through his work and his hunting, that he had respected the bears he hunted and the wilderness he inhabited, that his death was a tragedy, not a morality tale. These defenses, while heartfelt, often missed the point that most media coverage was making, which was not that Frank deserved to die, but simply that his death illustrated the real dangers of living in proximity to large predators and the complexity of human-wildlife relationships in the modern world. Animal rights activists, conversely, pointed to Frank's death as evidence that hunting was wrong, that killing animals for sport or trophies was morally indefensible, that Frank's taxidermy collection had been obscene, and that its destruction by a bear had a certain poetic justice to it, even if his death itself was regrettable. These arguments, while popular in certain circles, were rejected by most Alaskans who understood that hunting was not just a recreational activity, but a deeply embedded part of the state's culture and economy, and that Frank's death had nothing to do with the ethics of hunting and everything to do with the practical realities of living in bear country. The debate raged on social media and in opinion pages for weeks, gradually fading as other stories captured public attention, but the core questions remained unresolved because they were fundamentally unresolvable. Questions about humanity's relationship with nature, about the ethics of hunting, about how to balance human safety with wildlife conservation, about whether places like Kodiak Island should be preserved as wilderness or made safer for human habitation. Frank's death provided no answers to these questions. It simply illustrated their complexity and their stakes. Bear 341, the animal responsible for Frank's death, was never captured or killed, and as of the writing of this account, it remains at large somewhere on Kodiak Island, a ghost in the wilderness, a symbol of wildness and danger that exists just beyond the edges of human control. Fish and Game maintained an active alert about the bear for months after the attack, warning residents and visitors that a dangerous bear was operating in the western part of the island. But as time passed without any new incidents, the alert level was reduced and eventually dropped altogether, the bear becoming just another risk factor in an environment full of risks, something to be aware of but not obsessed over, something to respect but not fear irrationally. Occasionally, reports would come in of a very large male bear exhibiting bold behavior in the western Kodiak area, and wildlife technicians would investigate and sometimes wonder if they had found Bear 341. But without DNA sampling or clear identifying features, it was impossible to be certain, and the question of whether any particular bear was the one that had killed Frank Dawson became less urgent as years passed and the bear aged, and eventually would die of natural causes or be killed by a hunter or by another bear in a territorial dispute. Its death unremarked and unnoticed, just another animal returning to the earth. Sarah Brennan never fully recovered from her father's death, not in the sense of getting over it or moving on, but rather in the sense of learning to live with a permanent loss, a hole in her life where her father had been. She thought about him often, usually not about his death, but about his life, about the times they had spent together when she was young, about his patient teaching as he showed her how to fish and how to read the weather and how to move quietly through the forest. She regretted that her own children had not known him better, had not had the opportunity to learn from him the way she had, and she told them stories about their grandfather, about his adventures and his skills and his love for the wilderness, trying to keep his memory alive, even as the details faded and the man himself became more mythical than real in her children's imagination. She never hunted again, had never really hunted much anyway, but after her father's death, she found herself unable to even consider the activity, unable to separate it from the violence that had killed him, unable to see the sport or the tradition or the conservation benefits that hunting advocates emphasized. This put distance between her and some of her extended family, other relatives, who still hunted and who saw her rejection of it as a rejection of them and of their shared heritage. But Sarah made peace with that distance, recognizing that grief had changed her in ways that would never be reversed, and that she needed to honor those changes rather than resist them. She developed a complicated relationship with bears, simultaneously fascinated by them and terrified of them, unable to see one even in a zoo without thinking of her father and what had happened to him. She read extensively about bear behavior, about attacks, about the statistical likelihood of being killed by a bear versus being killed by any of the countless other dangers that existed in the world, and she came to understand intellectually that bears were not evil or even particularly dangerous relative to their size and capabilities, that the vast majority of human-bear encounters ended peacefully, that her father's death had been statistically improbable, a perfect storm of circumstances that aligned in the worst possible way. But emotional understanding lagged behind intellectual understanding, and when she saw a bear, even in a photograph or a nature documentary, she felt her heart rate spike and her breath catch, and the visceral memory of standing in her father's cabin, looking at his blood on the floor. Time helped, as it always does, softening the sharpest edges of grief, if not eliminating it entirely. And by 2027, Sarah found that she could think about her father without immediately thinking about his death, could remember the good times without the bad times overwhelming them, could tell her children stories about their grandfather that ended with laughter rather than tears. She never returned to Alaska after closing out her father's estate, finding that the state itself had become associated with his death in a way that made it painful to visit. And she made peace with the fact that a place she had once loved, a place that had been her childhood home every summer, was now closed to her by trauma and grief. Her marriage to David survived the stress of her father's death, though it required work and patience and a willingness to communicate about the ways that grief was affecting her, and by extension, affecting their relationship. David had liked Frank, had respected him even when he disagreed with his choices, and he felt his own sense of loss at Frank's death. But his grief was different from Sarah's, less consuming, less life-altering, and he sometimes struggled to understand why Sarah couldn't just move on, couldn't just accept that bad things happen and life continues. But he tried, and Sarah appreciated his trying, and together they navigated the difficult years following Frank's death and emerged with their relationship intact, if changed. The cabin where Frank died changed hands twice more in the years following his death, each sale at a progressively lower price, as the property's history became more widely known and more difficult to ignore. The second owners, the young couple from Anchorage, lasted only 1 year before deciding that the isolation and the bears and the knowledge of what had happened there were too much to handle, that the romantic idea of wilderness living was very different from the reality. The third owners, an older couple who had lived in Alaska their entire lives and who were not particularly bothered by the property's history, made the cabin their permanent residence and lived there without incident, though they took extensive precautions that Frank had not, including installing motion-activated lights and alarms, securing all food in bear-proof containers, keeping the door locked at all times, and carrying firearms whenever they went outside. The destroyed taxidermy collection, what little remained of it after the bear's rampage, was eventually disposed of in various ways. Some pieces that were minimally damaged were restored and sold to collectors, bringing in enough money to partially offset the losses that Frank's estate had suffered. Other pieces, too damaged to restore, were discarded as trash, unceremoniously dumped in a landfill where they decomposed alongside ordinary garbage, the trophies of a lifetime reduced to biological waste. The massive Kodiak bear mount, Frank's centerpiece and pride, was beyond salvage. Its hide torn to pieces, its form destroyed, its glass eyes lost somewhere in the wreckage of the cabin, and it ended its existence as it had begun, as bear parts, organic matter, nature reclaiming itself. The broader impact of Frank's death on wildlife policy in Alaska was significant, but not revolutionary. The incident prompted renewed discussion about bear management, about human-wildlife conflict, about the challenges of living in proximity to large predators. But it did not result in any major policy changes or shifts in philosophy. Alaska remained committed to maintaining healthy bear populations, to allowing hunting as a management tool, to preserving wilderness areas where bears and humans coexisted uneasily, and Frank's death was treated as a tragic outlier rather than evidence of systemic problems requiring systemic solutions. The statistical reality was that bear attacks remained rare, that thousands of people lived and worked in bear country every year without incident, that the risk of being killed by a bear was orders of magnitude lower than the risk of being killed in a car accident or by heart disease or by any number of other causes that received far less attention. But statistics provided little comfort to Sarah Brennan or to anyone else who had been directly affected by Frank's death, because statistics measured populations and probabilities, while individual experience measured loss and pain and the specific tragedy of one man dying alone and terrified on his kitchen floor, mauled by a bear in his own home, his life ending in violence after 74 years of competence and survival. The statistical rarity of his death made it no less real, no less tragic, no less meaningful to the people who had known him and loved him. In the end, Frank Joseph Dawson's life and death became part of the larger story of humanity's complicated relationship with wilderness and wildlife, a relationship that encompasses wonder and fear, respect and exploitation, preservation and destruction, love and violence, all existing simultaneously in uneasy tension. Frank had devoted his life to the wilderness, had made his living from it, had shaped his identity around it, and in return the wilderness had given him adventure and beauty and purpose, and ultimately it had given him death, the final gift that wilderness gives to all who spend enough time in it, because the wilderness is indifferent to human desires and human lives, operating according to its own rules, taking what it wants, when it wants, respecting nothing except force and luck and the inexorable processes of nature. Frank's daughter Sarah would sometimes wonder, in the years after his death, whether her father would have wanted to die differently, whether he would have preferred a quiet passing in a hospital bed or a sudden heart attack in his sleep, or any of the countless other ways that elderly people typically die. And she would conclude, after much thought, that probably not, that Frank would have chosen to die in the wilderness if given the choice, would have chosen a death that was connected to the life he had lived, rather than a death that was medical and sterile and removed from everything he had cared about. Not this death, certainly, not this violence, not this terror, but some version of wilderness death, some ending that was appropriate to the life that had preceded it. Whether this conclusion was accurate or merely comforting, Sarah could never be sure, because her father was dead and could not be asked, and the dead take their preferences with them into silence, leaving the living to construct narratives that make sense of senseless loss, to find meaning in random tragedy, to tell stories that connect the end of a life to everything that came before, in a way that suggests purpose or destiny or some kind of cosmic justice. Frank's story, the story of his life and his death, was ultimately just another story of a human being trying to make a place for himself in a world that was beautiful and terrible and indifferent, a world that gave freely but took capriciously, a world that promised nothing except that eventually, inevitably, it would reclaim everything it had given, that all human efforts to build and preserve and create were temporary, that the wilderness always won in the end, that the bears would outlast the humans, that nature would persist long after civilization had crumbled and been forgotten. And somewhere on Kodiak Island, in the endless forest, in the shadow of the mountains, in the vast wilderness that had been Frank Dawson's home and his killer, Bear 341 moved through its territory, hunting and sleeping and living according to the ancient patterns of its species, unconcerned with human justice or human grief or human understanding, simply existing, simply being a bear, dangerous and magnificent and free, a reminder that humanity's control over nature is partial and temporary and ultimately illusory, that we share this planet with creatures that do not recognize our laws or respect our boundaries or care about our lives, and that this shared existence requires us to be humble and careful and aware of our vulnerability, or we will pay the price that Frank Dawson paid, the ultimate price, the final price, the price of blood and death, and the silence that follows. The next stories, September 2nd, 2025, Polar bear devours 41-year-old pilot after plane crash in Nunavut. The Arctic wind howled across the endless expanse of tundra near Baker Lake, Nunavut, carrying with it the scent of approaching winter and something far more sinister. At 2:47 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time, the red and white Cessna 206, piloted by Richard Marcus Thompson, began its fateful descent toward what would become one of the most horrific wildlife encounters in Canadian aviation history. Richard Thompson, a seasoned bush pilot with over 18 years of experience flying across the treacherous Northern Territories, had departed from Yellowknife that morning with a routine cargo run to Baker Lake. The 41-year-old father of three had logged more than 12,000 flight hours across the Northwest Territories and Nunavut, earning a reputation among mining companies and government agencies as one of the most reliable pilots operating above the 60th parallel. His weathered hands gripped the controls of Charlie Golf Papa Whiskey Hotel, a 1998 Cessna 206 that had been his faithful companion for the past 7 years. Born in Thompson, Manitoba, Richard had grown up with aviation in his blood. His father, Robert Thompson, had been a transport pilot during the Second World War, flying supply missions across the Pacific. After the war, Robert had moved north, drawn by the promise of good work flying for mining companies and government surveys. Richard had spent his childhood listening to his father's stories of close calls with weather, mechanical failures, and the unforgiving nature of northern flying. When Robert died in a crash near Norman Wells in 1995, Richard had been working as a mechanic in Winnipeg. The loss drove him to obtain his pilot's license, determined to honor his father's memory by mastering the same skies that had claimed him. Richard's wife, Sarah Elizabeth Thompson, a nurse at Stanton Territorial Hospital in Yellowknife, had married him in 2008, fully aware of the risks inherent in his profession. Their 3 children, Michael, age 15, Emma 13, and little Thomas, just 8 years old, had grown up understanding that Daddy's job sometimes meant weeks away from home, flying to remote communities and mining sites across the vast Northern Territories. Sarah often lay awake during Richard's overnight trips, listening to weather reports on the radio and checking flight tracking websites until she saw his aircraft safely landed at their destination. On the morning of September 2nd, Richard had kissed Sarah goodbye at 5:30 a.m., promising to be home by evening for Thomas's soccer practice. The cargo manifest listed medical supplies, mail and replacement parts for the Baker Lake weather station, along with a passenger manifest showing 3 travelers. Dr. Marcus Webb, a geologist from the University of Alberta, Jennifer Louise Cascade, a documentary filmmaker from Toronto, and Nathan Crow Feather, a local guide from Baker Lake, returning home after medical treatment in Yellowknife. Dr. Marcus Webb, 53 years old and a professor of Arctic geology at the University of Alberta, had spent the past 2 weeks in Yellowknife consulting with the Geological Survey of Canada about mineral formations near Baker Lake. A tall, lean man with prematurely grey hair and wire-rimmed glasses, Marcus had dedicated his career to understanding the geological history of the Canadian Arctic. He had published over 40 peer-reviewed papers on Arctic geology and had spent portions of the past 15 summers conducting field research across Nunavut and the Northwest Territories. His ex-wife, Patricia, often joked that he loved rocks more than people, a criticism that stung because Marcus suspected it might be true. His dedication to his work had cost him his marriage 3 years earlier, but he found solace in the pristine wilderness of the Arctic, where ancient geological stories were written in stone and ice. Jennifer Louise Cascade, 38 years old, had built her reputation as a documentary filmmaker specializing in climate change and indigenous communities. Her previous film, Melting Horizons, had won several awards and brought international attention to the impacts of climate change on Arctic communities. Born and raised in downtown Toronto, Jennifer had initially studied journalism at Ryerson University before transitioning to documentary filmmaking. Her parents, both successful lawyers, had never understood her fascination with remote places and environmental issues. Jennifer's current project focused on traditional Inuit hunting practices and how climate change was affecting polar bear behavior and migration patterns. She had spent the past month in Yellowknife interviewing elders and researchers, gathering background material before traveling to Baker Lake to begin the primary filming phase of her documentary. Nathan Crow Feather, a 67-year-old Inuit elder and traditional knowledge keeper from Baker Lake, had been in Yellowknife for cataract surgery. Nathan's deep knowledge of the land, weather patterns, and wildlife behavior had made him an invaluable guide for researchers and filmmakers working in the region. He had grown up on the land, learning traditional hunting and survival skills from his grandfather, and had witnessed firsthand the dramatic changes occurring in the Arctic over the past several decades. Nathan spoke fluent Inuktitut, English, and some French, and had worked as a cultural liaison between researchers and the community for over 20 years. His presence on Jennifer's documentary project was considered essential for providing authentic cultural context and ensuring respectful representation of Inuit perspectives. The weather forecast for September 2nd had called for clear skies with light winds, ideal conditions for the 3-hour flight from Yellowknife to Baker Lake. However, as Richard's Cessna progressed northward, a weather system that meteorologists had not anticipated began developing rapidly. Arctic weather patterns had become increasingly unpredictable in recent years, a phenomenon that experienced northern pilots like Richard attributed to broader climate change impacts. At 1:15 p.m., approximately 90 minutes into the flight, Richard noticed the first signs of the developing weather system. The sky ahead began to darken, and his onboard weather radar started showing precipitation returns that had not been there during his pre-flight briefing. Richard contacted Yellowknife Flight Service to request updated weather information for Baker Lake. Yellowknife Flight Service, this is Cessna Golf Papa Whiskey Hotel, request current weather for Baker Lake, Richard transmitted over the radio. Golf Papa Whiskey Hotel, Yellowknife Flight Service. Current Baker Lake weather, wind 270 at 15, gusting 25. Visibility 6 miles in light snow, ceiling 2,000 broken, temperature -2 degrees Celsius, altimeter 2985. Weather deteriorating, next observation in 30 minutes. Richard frowned as he processed the weather report. The conditions had deteriorated significantly since his departure briefing, and the trend was not favorable. The gusting winds and lowering ceiling concerned him, but the flight was still within acceptable parameters for a visual approach to Baker Lake's gravel runway. Dr. Webb, seated in the front right passenger seat, noticed Richard's concerned expression. "Everything all right up there, Captain?" he asked, using the formal title that passengers often employed when addressing pilots. "Weather's getting a bit rough ahead," Richard replied, his voice steady and professional. "Nothing we can't handle, but we might experience some turbulence as we get closer to Baker Lake." Jennifer, seated directly behind Dr. Webb, was reviewing her filming schedule and interview notes when the aircraft encountered the first significant turbulence. Her camera equipment, carefully secured in the cargo area, remained stable, but she felt the familiar flutter of nervousness that always accompanied rough air. She had flown countless times for her documentary work, but turbulence never failed to remind her of the fundamental fragility of human flight. Nathan, occupying the rear left seat, gazed out the window at the changing landscape below. Even through the developing clouds, he could identify familiar landmarks and traditional travel routes that his people had used for generations. The sight of the vast tundra, dotted with countless lakes and crossed by ancient caribou migration paths, filled him with a deep sense of connection to the land. However, Nathan's experienced eye also noticed subtle changes in the cloud formations and wind patterns that suggested the weather system was intensifying more rapidly than the official forecast had predicted. At 2:20 p.m., Richard made his final position report to Flight Service. Yellowknife Flight Service, Golf Papa Whiskey Hotel, is 25 miles southeast of Baker Lake, beginning descent for visual approach runway 09. Golf Papa Whiskey Hotel, Yellowknife Flight Service, Roger. Contact Baker Lake Aerodrome Advisory on frequency 123.2. Weather update, wind 300 at 20, gusting 35. Visibility 3 miles in moderate snow. Ceiling 1,500 broken, 1,000 overcast. The deteriorating weather conditions meant that Richard would need to conduct a more challenging approach than originally planned. The gusty crosswinds and reduced visibility required careful attention to airspeed and aircraft control, but these were conditions that Richard had successfully navigated hundreds of times during his career. As the Cessna descended through the cloud layer, the passengers got their first clear view of the landscape around Baker Lake. The community of approximately 2,000 residents sat on the western shore of Baker Lake, one of the largest lakes in Nunavut. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, characterized by rolling tundra, scattered boulders left by ancient glaciers, and countless small lakes and ponds that reflected the grey sky above. At 2:35 p.m., as Richard lined up for his approach to runway 09, a sudden and severe downdraft associated with the weather system caught the aircraft. The Cessna dropped rapidly, forcing Richard to add power and adjust his approach angle. The aircraft shuddered as it encountered severe turbulence, and Richard could hear the worried murmurs of his passengers behind him. "Hold on back there," Richard called over his shoulder, his voice tight with concentration. "We're almost through this rough air." Dr. Webb gripped his armrests tightly, watching Richard's hands move expertly across the controls as he fought to maintain control of the aircraft. The academic had flown countless times for his research, but he had never experienced turbulence this severe. He found himself studying Richard's calm demeanor and professional responses, drawing reassurance from the pilot's obvious competence and experience. Nathan, drawing on decades of experience reading weather patterns and natural signs, recognized that the storm system was intensifying far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The traditional knowledge passed down through generations had taught him to read subtle environmental cues that modern meteorology sometimes missed. The way the clouds moved, the pressure changes he felt in his bones, and the behavior of the few birds visible through the aircraft windows all suggested that this weather system was developing into something dangerous. At 2:41 p.m., just 4 miles from the Baker Lake Airport, Richard encountered a second, more severe downdraft that pushed the aircraft dangerously close to the ground. As he struggled to regain altitude, the Cessna's engine began running roughly, likely due to ice formation in the carburetor. Richard immediately applied carburetor heat and enriched the fuel mixture, standard procedures for dealing with carburetor icing. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Cessna Golf Papa Whiskey Hotel, declaring an emergency," Richard transmitted over the radio. "Experiencing severe turbulence and possible engine trouble 4 miles southeast of Baker Lake Airport, requesting immediate clearance for emergency landing." The response from Baker Lake Airport came immediately. "Golf Papa Whiskey Hotel, Baker Lake Tower, emergency equipment is being notified. You are cleared for emergency landing any runway. Current winds 310 at 30, gusting 40. Visibility 2 miles in heavy snow." Richard's years of experience and training took over as he focused entirely on flying the aircraft. He reduced power slightly to prevent overstressing the engine while maintaining sufficient airspeed to penetrate the headwinds and downdrafts. The aircraft bucked and shuddered as it fought through the turbulent air, and Richard could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold air infiltrating the cabin. Dr. Webb turned in his seat to check on Jennifer and Nathan. Both passengers appeared frightened, but were following standard emergency procedures, ensuring their seatbelts were tight and loose objects were secured. Jennifer had stopped reviewing her notes and was gripping her seatbelt with white knuckles, while Nathan sat calmly, his weathered hands folded in his lap, drawing on the stoic acceptance of danger that came from a lifetime spent in the unforgiving Arctic environment. At 2:44 p.m., as Richard struggled to maintain control of the aircraft in the increasingly violent turbulence, a massive downdraft struck the Cessna with unprecedented force. The aircraft dropped nearly 300 feet in seconds, and Richard found himself fighting for control as the airspeed fluctuated wildly between dangerous extremes. The carburetor ice problem worsened, causing the engine to run increasingly roughly and lose power. "We're going down," Richard announced to his passengers, his voice steady despite the desperate nature of their situation. "Brace for impact, keep your heads down, and stay in your seats until we come to a complete stop." The emergency landing procedures that Richard had practiced countless times in training suddenly became a life-or-death reality. He scanned the terrain below, looking for the best available landing spot in the rocky, uneven tundra. The area was characterized by scattered boulders, small lakes, and patches of marshy ground that would make any forced landing extremely challenging. Nathan, recognizing the gravity of their situation, began speaking quietly in Inuktitut, offering traditional prayers for protection and safe passage. His calm acceptance provided a stabilizing influence on the other passengers, who looked to his composed demeanor for reassurance in the face of impending disaster. Richard spotted a relatively flat area of tundra approximately 2 miles southeast of the airport and committed to an emergency landing. The terrain was far from ideal, with scattered rocks and uneven ground, but it offered the best chance of survival given their rapidly deteriorating options. He configured the aircraft for a soft field landing, raising the flaps to their maximum extension and maintaining just enough airspeed to prevent a stall. At 2:47 p.m., the Cessna 206 touched down hard on the tundra, bouncing twice before the main landing gear caught in a depression between two large boulders. The aircraft slewed sideways, and Richard felt the sickening sensation of the landing gear collapsing as the airplane came to rest approximately 15 degrees nose down, facing northwest toward Baker Lake. The immediate aftermath of the crash was eerily quiet, broken only by the sound of cooling metal and the whistle of Arctic wind through gaps in the damaged aircraft structure. Richard, though shaken and bruised, quickly assessed his own condition and that of his passengers. Miraculously, all 4 occupants had survived the crash landing with only minor injuries, a testament to Richard's skill as a pilot and the robust construction of the Cessna 206. Dr. Webb had sustained a mild concussion when his head struck the side window during the impact, but he remained conscious and coherent. Jennifer had suffered bruised ribs from her seatbelt harness, but was otherwise uninjured. Nathan, despite his age, appeared to have escaped serious injury, though he complained of soreness in his lower back. Richard immediately activated his emergency locator transmitter ELT and attempted to contact Baker Lake on his aircraft radio. The radio appeared to be functional, though the antenna may have been damaged during the crash. His first priority was to notify authorities of their location and condition, then assess the aircraft and surrounding area for immediate dangers. Mayday, Mayday, Baker Lake Tower. This is Golf Papa Whiskey Hotel on the ground, approximately 2 miles southeast of the airport. 4 souls on board, all conscious and mobile. Aircraft is damaged, but intact. Requesting immediate assistance. The response came within minutes. Golf Papa Whiskey Hotel, Baker Lake Tower, we have your emergency locator signal. Search and rescue has been notified. Can you provide more specific location information? Richard consulted his GPS unit, which had remained functional despite the crash. Baker Lake Tower, our position is approximately 64 degrees, 15 minutes north, 96 degrees, 08 minutes west. We are in a relatively flat area of tundra with scattered boulders. Aircraft is visible from the air. Golf Papa Whiskey Hotel, Roger. Search and rescue coordinator has been notified. Estimated time of arrival for ground search team is 45 minutes, weather permitting. Are there any serious injuries requiring immediate medical attention? Negative on serious injuries at this time, Richard responded. All passengers are conscious and mobile, but we will need assistance evacuating from this location. Richard's training and experience had taught him that survival in the Arctic depended on immediate action to address the fundamental needs of shelter, warmth, and signaling for rescue. The outside air temperature was -2 degrees Celsius, and the wind chill made conditions significantly more severe. With the approaching weather system, conditions would likely deteriorate further as the afternoon progressed. The crash had occurred in an area of tundra characterized by low-growing Arctic vegetation, scattered glacial erratics ranging from basketball-sized rocks to boulders the size of automobiles, and numerous small depressions that collected water during the brief Arctic summer. The terrain offered little natural shelter from the wind, and the nearest tree line was more than 200 kilometers to the south. Richard began organizing his passengers for survival. His aircraft carried standard emergency equipment, including sleeping bags, emergency food rations, a first aid kit, flares, and basic survival tools. The cargo area also contained the supplies they had been transporting to Baker Lake, including medical supplies that might prove useful if anyone's condition deteriorated. Dr. Webb, despite his mild concussion, insisted on helping with the survival preparations. His academic background had included wilderness first aid training, and he methodically inventoried the medical supplies in both the aircraft's first aid kit and the cargo they had been transporting. Jennifer, recognizing that her documentary project had suddenly become a survival situation, secured her camera equipment and began documenting their circumstances, understanding that the footage might be valuable for search and rescue efforts or subsequent investigation. Nathan took charge of assessing their immediate environment, drawing on traditional knowledge about Arctic survival and wildlife. His experienced eye noted several concerning factors. The approaching weather system would likely bring snow and much colder temperatures. The area showed evidence of recent polar bear activity, including old tracks and scat, and their location was along a natural corridor that bears used when traveling between hunting areas. "Richard," Nathan said quietly, pulling the pilot aside, "we need to be very careful here. This area is known polar bear country, and with this weather coming in, a bear looking for shelter might be drawn to investigate our crash site." Richard nodded gravely. He was aware of polar bear risks in the region, but his immediate focus had been on basic survival and rescue coordination. Nathan's warning reminded him that they faced multiple threats: the deteriorating weather, the risk of hypothermia, potential injuries that might worsen, and the very real possibility of dangerous wildlife encounters. At 3:15 p.m., approximately 30 minutes after the crash, Richard made another radio contact with Baker Lake. "Baker Lake Tower, Golf Papa Whiskey Hotel. Current status: all passengers remain stable, aircraft emergency equipment deployed. We have established a basic shelter using the aircraft and emergency supplies. Request update on search and rescue status." Golf Papa Whiskey Hotel, Baker Lake Tower. Search and rescue team is currently delayed due to deteriorating weather conditions. Ground team cannot safely proceed until wind speeds decrease. Helicopter rescue is not possible in current conditions. Estimated delay is 2 to 3 hours minimum. The news that rescue would be delayed significantly changed their situation from a short-term emergency to a potentially overnight survival scenario. Richard communicated this information to his passengers, emphasizing the need to conserve body heat, remain hydrated, and maintain their spirits while they waited for conditions to improve. Jennifer continued documenting their situation, reasoning that the footage might be valuable for search and rescue coordination or subsequent analysis. Her camera captured the harsh beauty of the Arctic landscape, the damaged aircraft resting on the tundra, and the determined efforts of the 4 survivors to establish a sustainable shelter while they waited for rescue. Dr. Webb worked with Richard to conduct a more thorough assessment of everyone's physical condition. His mild concussion symptoms appeared stable, with no worsening of headache or confusion. Jennifer's bruised ribs were painful, but did not appear to indicate serious internal injuries. Nathan's back soreness seemed to be improving with rest and movement. Richard himself had sustained minor cuts and bruises, but was functioning normally. As the afternoon progressed, the weather continued to deteriorate. Snow began falling more heavily, and the wind speed increased, creating whiteout conditions that would make any rescue attempt extremely dangerous. The temperature dropped steadily, and by 4 p.m., the outside air temperature had fallen to -8 degrees Celsius, with the wind chill approaching -20 degrees. Nathan's concerns about polar bear activity proved prophetic when, at approximately 4:30 p.m., he spotted fresh tracks in the snow near a small pond about 200 meters from their crash site. The tracks were unmistakably those of a large polar bear, and the snow accumulation in the prints suggested they had been made within the past few hours. "We have a problem," Nathan announced quietly to Richard, pointing toward the tracks visible through his binoculars. "Large polar bear, probably an adult male based on the size of these prints. The tracks are fresh, and they're heading in our general direction." Richard felt his stomach drop as he processed this information. Polar bears were among the most dangerous predators in the Arctic, capable of traveling vast distances in search of food. An adult male could weigh over 500 kilograms and possess the strength to easily overcome human beings. Unlike their southern cousins, polar bears had no natural fear of humans and would readily attack if they perceived people as potential prey or threats. The standard advice for polar bear encounters emphasized avoidance and early warning systems. However, their current situation offered limited options for avoidance, and their crash site was clearly visible across the open tundra. The damaged aircraft provided some shelter from the weather, but would offer little protection against a determined polar bear attack. Richard immediately radioed Baker Lake with this new information. "Baker Lake Tower, Golf Papa Whiskey Hotel. We have confirmed fresh polar bear tracks in our immediate area, requesting immediate advice on wildlife protocols and updated rescue timeline." The response carried a new urgency. "Golf Papa Whiskey Hotel, Baker Lake Tower. Polar bear threat acknowledged. Recommend maintaining constant watch, making noise to advertise your presence, and preparing defensive measures. Wildlife officer advises that bears in this area are typically searching for food sources and may investigate unusual disturbances. Search and rescue team is attempting to expedite response despite weather conditions." Dr. Webb, Jennifer, and Nathan gathered around Richard as he explained the new threat they faced. The academic in Webb wanted to understand the bear's behavior patterns and motivations, while Jennifer saw the dramatic story unfolding and continued documenting their situation. Nathan drew on traditional knowledge about polar bear behavior, explaining how weather conditions and seasonal patterns might influence the animal's actions. "In traditional times, our hunters would avoid traveling alone in weather like this," Nathan explained. "Bears become more unpredictable when storms disrupt their normal hunting patterns. A bear might approach our crash site out of curiosity, hunger, or simply because we represent the only unusual feature in an otherwise empty landscape." Richard organized their defensive preparations based on standard polar bear protocols. They gathered together all available noise-making devices, including the aircraft's horn, metal tools that could be banged together, and emergency whistles. Flares were positioned for easy access, both for signaling rescue aircraft and potentially deterring a bear approach. The aircraft's emergency axe was retrieved from its storage location and positioned where Richard could access it quickly. At 5:15 p.m., as the Arctic twilight began to deepen and snow continued to fall heavily, Nathan spotted movement approximately 400 meters to the northeast of their position. Through the swirling snow, the distinctive yellowish-white shape of a large polar bear was visible, moving slowly across the tundra in their general direction. "There," Nathan whispered, pointing toward the approaching figure. "Adult male, very large. He's not coming directly toward us yet, but he's definitely aware of our presence." Richard immediately activated the aircraft's emergency horn, producing a loud, sustained blast that echoed across the tundra. The bear stopped and raised its head, clearly alerted by the sound. For several minutes, the animal remained motionless, apparently assessing this unusual intrusion into its territory. Dr. Webb studied the bear through binoculars, noting its behavior and physical characteristics. The animal appeared to be in good physical condition, with a thick coat of fur and the massive build characteristic of adult male polar bears. Its movements were deliberate and confident, showing none of the hesitation or fear that might indicate previous negative encounters with humans. Jennifer continued filming, capturing the surreal scene of the massive predator moving across the Arctic landscape, while 4 humans huddled around their damaged aircraft. The documentary maker in her recognized the extraordinary nature of what was unfolding, even as her human instincts focused on survival. The bear began moving again, this time more directly toward their crash site. Its pace was unhurried but purposeful, suggesting a level of curiosity about these unusual visitors to its domain. Richard prepared to use additional noise deterrents, while Nathan explained traditional methods for dealing with polar bear encounters. "Making noise is good," Nathan said, "but if he decides to investigate us more closely, we need to appear large and threatening." Bears sometimes respond to confident, aggressive behavior, but we must be very careful not to provoke an attack. At 5:30 p.m., the bear had approached to within 200 meters of their position, close enough to clearly observe its massive size and powerful build. Richard estimated the animal's weight at well over 400 kilograms, making it one of the largest predators any of them had ever encountered. The bear paused again, apparently studying the crash site and its human occupants. Richard radioed Baker Lake with an urgent update. "Baker Lake Tower, Golf Papa Whiskey Hotel. Polar bear now within 200 meters of our position and approaching. Request immediate assistance. Any available options. Golf Papa Whiskey Hotel, stand by." After a tense pause, the radio crackled with new information. "Wildlife officer recommends continuous noise. Appear large, do not run or make sudden movements. Conservation officer with tranquilizer equipment is attempting to reach your location, but is still at least 90 minutes away due to weather conditions." 90 minutes felt like an eternity as the four survivors watched the massive predator continue its approach. The bear moved with the unhurried confidence of an apex predator that had never encountered anything capable of challenging its dominance. Its black nose tested the air currents, gathering scent information about these strange creatures that had appeared in its territory. At 5:45 p.m., the bear had closed to within 100 meters, and its intentions appeared increasingly aggressive. Rather than the curious investigation they had initially hoped for, the animal's body language suggested a predator evaluating potential prey. Its ears were forward, its eyes fixed on the crash site, and its movements had taken on the purposeful quality of a hunting approach. Richard made the decision to fire a warning flare, hoping the bright light and loud report might discourage the bear's approach. The flare streaked across the darkening sky, exploding in a brilliant red burst approximately 50 meters in front of the approaching animal. The bear stopped, clearly startled by the sudden light and noise, but it did not retreat. Instead, it stood on its hind legs, rising to its full height of nearly 3 meters to get a better view of these strange creatures and their activities. Dr. Webb watched the bear's behavior with the analytical mind of a scientist, even as his human instincts screamed warnings about their desperate situation. The animal's response to the flare suggested intelligence and adaptability rather than simple fear. It was assessing the threat level and determining its next course of action. Nathan began speaking in Inuktitut, not to the bear, but offering traditional prayers for protection and guidance. His calm demeanor provided stability for the group, even as he recognized that their situation had become extremely dangerous. Traditional knowledge included various methods for dealing with polar bears, but most assumed the availability of weapons or escape routes that they currently lacked. At 6 p.m., as the Arctic night deepened and the snowfall intensified, the bear dropped back to all fours and resumed its approach. This time, its movement was more direct and purposeful, suggesting that it had decided these unusual visitors warranted closer investigation. The animal moved with the rolling gait characteristic of polar bears, its massive paws making little sound on the snow-covered tundra. Richard prepared their remaining flares and signaling devices while mentally reviewing their limited options. The aircraft provided some protection, but polar bears were known to be capable of tearing through aircraft aluminum if sufficiently motivated. Their emergency acts would be virtually useless against an animal of this size and power. Their best hope remained the arrival of rescue personnel with appropriate wildlife deterrent equipment. Jennifer continued documenting their situation, understanding that if they did not survive, the footage might provide valuable information about polar bear behavior and the circumstances of their deaths. The irony was not lost on her that her documentary about climate change and polar bear behavior might end with her own death at the claws of one of these magnificent predators. At 6:15 p.m., the bear had approached to within 50 meters, close enough for them to hear its breathing and see the individual hairs of its coat. The animal paused again, apparently studying the crash site and making final assessments about these potential prey items. Its behavior suggested a level of intelligence and calculation that made it even more formidable as a predator. Richard activated the aircraft horn again, producing another sustained blast that echoed across the tundra. This time, the bear's response was different. Instead of stopping and assessing, the animal took several steps backward, then began circling their position at a distance of approximately 30 meters. This behavior was more concerning than a direct approach, as it suggested hunting tactics rather than simple curiosity. Nathan recognized the circling behavior as particularly dangerous. "This is not good," he said quietly. "Bears circle prey when they're planning an attack. Traditional knowledge says a circling bear is a hunting bear." The reality of their situation became clear to all four survivors. They were being stalked by one of the Arctic's most formidable predators in deteriorating weather conditions, with limited defensive options and rescue still hours away. The bear's behavior had transitioned from curiosity to active hunting, and their survival now depended on factors largely beyond their control. Dr. Webb found himself studying the bear's magnificent adaptation to Arctic conditions even as he feared for his life. The animal's coat provided insulation against temperatures that would kill unprotected humans within hours. Its massive paws distributed its weight across snow and ice, allowing it to move efficiently across terrain that challenged human travelers. Its predatory instincts had been honed by thousands of years of evolution in one of Earth's most challenging environments. At 6:30 p.m., the bear's circling pattern brought it close enough to the aircraft that Richard could see its eyes reflecting the light from their emergency beacon. The animal's gaze was fixed and predatory, showing none of the wariness that might indicate respect for human presence. This bear had clearly never learned to fear humans, making it exponentially more dangerous. Richard made another urgent radio call. "Baker Lake Tower, Golf Papa Whiskey Hotel emergency. Polar bear now within 30 meters and exhibiting hunting behavior. We need immediate assistance. Any available options? Golf Papa Whiskey Hotel, all available resources are being deployed. Weather conditions are still preventing helicopter operations, but ground team with wildlife control equipment is en route. Estimated arrival time 45 minutes. 45 minutes seemed like an impossibly long time as the four survivors watched the massive predator continue its stalking behavior. The bear moved with patience and calculation, apparently in no hurry to conclude its investigation of these unusual visitors to its territory. Jennifer's camera captured the bear's movements as it circled their position, the footage providing a terrifying record of apex predator behavior in the wild. The documentary filmmaker in her recognized the extraordinary nature of what she was recording, even as her human survival instincts focused entirely on staying alive until rescue arrived. At 6:45 p.m., the bear's behavior changed again. Instead of continuing its circular pattern, the animal began moving directly toward the aircraft, its approach slow and deliberate. Richard prepared to use their remaining flares, while Nathan gathered everyone close to the aircraft's emergency exit, ready to implement whatever defensive measures they could manage. The bear approached to within 20 meters, then 15, then 10. At this distance, its massive size became truly apparent. The animal's shoulder height was approximately 1.5 meters, and its total length appeared to exceed 3 meters. Its paws were larger than dinner plates, equipped with claws capable of tearing through aircraft aluminum or human flesh with equal ease. Dr. Webb noted the bear's calm, almost leisurely approach. Unlike the aggressive charges he had seen in wildlife documentaries, this animal moved with the confidence of a predator that had no doubt about the outcome of any confrontation. Its behavior suggested intelligence and experience, possibly indicating an older animal that had successfully hunted a variety of prey throughout its life. Richard fired their second flare, this time aiming directly over the bear's head. The brilliant red burst illuminated the snow-covered tundra and the massive predator, creating a surreal scene that would be burned into the memories of all 4 survivors. The bear paused but did not retreat, instead standing on its hind legs again to assess this new development. Nathan began banging metal tools together, creating as much noise as possible to demonstrate human presence and potentially discourage the bear's approach. The clanging echoed across the empty tundra, a desperate human sound in the vast Arctic wilderness. The bear lowered itself back to all 4s and continued its approach, apparently undeterred by the noise. At 7 p.m., with the bear now within 5 meters of the aircraft, Richard made the decision to attempt to scare the animal away using the emergency axe and aggressive posturing. Drawing on every piece of advice he had ever heard about bear encounters, he opened the aircraft door, stepped outside, and began shouting while brandishing the axe. "Get back! Get away from here!" Richard shouted, his voice carrying across the tundra. He waved the axe above his head and stomped his feet, trying to appear as large and threatening as possible. For a moment it seemed the strategy might work. The bear paused, clearly noting this change in human behavior. However, rather than retreating, the bear's response demonstrated why polar bears are considered among the most dangerous predators on Earth. The animal's ears flattened against its head, its lips pulled back to reveal massive canine teeth, and it began moving forward again with clear, aggressive intent. Dr. Webb, watching from inside the aircraft, recognized the change in the bear's body language. This was no longer an investigation or even predatory stalking. The animal had interpreted Richard's aggressive display as a challenge to be met with force. The academic in him noted the fascinating behavioral response, even as his human instincts screamed warnings about the impending disaster. Nathan immediately moved to support Richard, exiting the aircraft with additional noise-making tools and adding his voice to the desperate attempt to discourage the bear's approach. Years of traditional knowledge about wildlife behavior guided his actions as he tried to position himself to provide Richard with backup while avoiding movements that might trigger a full attack. Jennifer continued filming from inside the aircraft, capturing the terrifying confrontation between Richard and one of the Arctic's most formidable predators. Her hands shook as she operated the camera, but she maintained focus on documenting what might be the final moments of their lives. At 7:05 p.m., the confrontation reached its climax. The polar bear, apparently concluding that these small creatures posed no real threat despite their noise and posturing, took several quick steps toward Richard. The pilot, recognizing that his bluff had failed, began backing toward the aircraft while continuing to wave the axe and shout. However, polar bears are capable of moving far faster than their size suggests. In a movement that lasted only seconds, but seemed to unfold in slow motion, the massive predator closed the distance between itself and Richard with frightening speed. The bear's initial strike was delivered with one massive paw, catching Richard across the chest and sending him sprawling backward onto the snow-covered tundra. Nathan reacted immediately, advancing toward the bear while making as much noise as possible and waving his arms to distract the animal from its attack on Richard. The elderly Inuit's courage in the face of certain death demonstrated the values and character that had allowed his people to survive in the Arctic for thousands of years. Dr. Webb and Jennifer watched in horror as the situation deteriorated beyond their worst fears. The academic found himself frozen by the surreal nature of what was unfolding, while Jennifer continued filming, understanding that this footage might be the only record of their final moments. The bear, having knocked Richard to the ground, turned its attention to Nathan's aggressive approach. For a moment, it seemed uncertain which human posed the greater threat or represented the more attractive prey. This moment of hesitation provided Richard with an opportunity to regain his feet and retreat toward the aircraft, blood streaming from claw marks across his chest. Richard stumbled back toward the aircraft, his chest burning from the bear's claws, but his injuries not immediately life-threatening. The thick fabric of his winter clothing had provided some protection against the full force of the attack. However, the blood from his wounds would only serve to increase the bear's interest in pursuing these potential prey items. Nathan continued his brave attempt to distract the bear, using traditional knowledge about animal behavior to position himself between the predator and his wounded companion. However, polar bears are not easily deterred once they have engaged in predatory behavior, and Nathan's courageous stand was unlikely to succeed against such a formidable opponent. At 7:10 p.m., the bear made its decision. Rather than pursuing the wounded Richard or engaging with Nathan's distraction attempts, the animal focused its attention on what it perceived as the most accessible prey. In a movement that demonstrated both power and precision, the polar bear turned toward Nathan and began its final approach. Dr. Webb, recognizing that they were witnessing a tragedy that they were powerless to prevent, began shouting and banging on the aircraft windows in a desperate attempt to distract the bear from its intended victim. Jennifer continued filming while simultaneously looking for anything that might be used as a weapon or distraction. Nathan, faced with the approaching predator, drew on traditional spiritual practices to prepare for what he understood might be his death. Rather than continuing to retreat or show fear, he stood his ground and began speaking in Inuktitut, offering prayers and acknowledging the power and dignity of the magnificent predator that would likely end his life. The polar bear's final attack was swift and decisive. In a coordinated movement that demonstrated the animal's hunting expertise, the bear knocked Nathan to the ground and delivered the powerful bite to the neck that would end the elderly Inuit's life within seconds. The attack was brutal, but mercifully quick, demonstrating the efficiency of a predator that had evolved to kill large prey with minimal struggle. Richard, despite his injuries, immediately fired their remaining flare directly at the bear, hoping to drive it away from Nathan's body. The bright explosion and loud report caused the bear to pause in its attack, but the damage had already been done. Nathan lay motionless on the snow-covered tundra, his life ended by one of the same predators that his ancestors had respected and feared for generations. Dr. Webb found himself witnessing the kind of predator-prey interaction that he had studied in academic settings, but never imagined experiencing firsthand. The clinical part of his mind noted the efficiency of the bear's attack methods, while his human emotions reeled from the horror of watching a companion die violently. Jennifer's camera continued recording the aftermath of the attack, capturing the bear's behavior as it investigated Nathan's body and the desperate actions of the three survivors huddled around their damaged aircraft. The footage would later provide valuable insights into polar bear behavior, but at the moment it simply documented the horror of their situation. The bear, having killed Nathan, began to feed, demonstrating the pragmatic approach to survival that characterizes all Arctic predators. The sight was horrifying for the three human survivors, but it also provided them with a temporary reprieve as the animal focused its attention on its kill rather than pursuing additional prey. Richard, Dr. Webb and Jennifer gathered inside the aircraft, applying first aid to Richard's injuries while maintaining constant watch for any change in the bear's behavior. The pilot's chest wounds, while painful and bloody, did not appear to have penetrated deeply enough to cause serious internal damage. However, the psychological trauma of the attack and Nathan's death had shaken all three survivors profoundly. At 7:25 p.m., Richard made another urgent radio call. Baker Lake Tower, Golf Papa Whiskey Hotel emergency. Polar bear has killed one of our passengers. Remaining three survivors are injured and trapped at crash site. We need immediate assistance. The response carried new urgency. Golf Papa Whiskey Hotel, search and rescue team with wildlife control equipment is now 20 minutes from your location. Conservation officers are also en route. Can you provide status of the bear? The bear is currently feeding approximately 30 meters from our aircraft, Richard responded, his voice tight with pain and shock. It has killed Nathan Crow Feather. 3 survivors remaining, 1 with injuries from bear attack. The news that rescue was only 20 minutes away provided some hope, but the presence of the feeding bear created a complex and dangerous situation. Conservation officers would need to approach carefully to avoid disturbing the animal and potentially triggering another attack on the crash site. Dr. Webb applied pressure to Richard's chest wounds while monitoring him for signs of shock or blood loss. The injuries appeared painful, but not immediately life-threatening, assuming they could prevent infection and provide proper medical care. However, their situation remained desperate as long as the polar bear remained in their immediate vicinity. Jennifer continued documenting their ordeal, understanding that the footage would provide valuable evidence about the circumstances of Nathan's death and the behavior of the polar bear. The documentary maker in her recognized the tragic irony that her project about climate change and polar bear behavior had ended with her experiencing firsthand the deadly reality of human-bear conflict. At 7:40 p.m., the sound of approaching snowmobile engines carried across the tundra, indicating that rescue personnel were finally arriving at their crash site. However, the presence of the feeding bear complicated any rescue attempt, as approaching too closely could provoke another attack. The conservation officers arrived first, equipped with tranquilizer equipment and firearms appropriate for dealing with dangerous wildlife. Their approach was cautious and professional, designed to minimize risk to both the human survivors and the polar bear if possible. Richard watched through the aircraft windows as the conservation officers took up positions around the crash site, their movements coordinated and precise. The lead officer established radio contact with the aircraft. Golf Papa Whiskey Hotel, this is Conservation Officer Mitchell. We have your position and can see the bear. We're going to attempt to tranquilize the animal to allow for your safe evacuation. The tranquilizer dart struck the polar bear in the hindquarters, delivering a dose of immobilizing drugs calculated for an adult male of the animal's estimated size. However, polar bears are extremely hardy animals, and the drugs would take several minutes to take effect, during which time the bear might become agitated or aggressive. The bear's reaction to being darted was immediate and concerning. The animal abandoned its feeding and began moving around the crash site, clearly agitated by the sudden pain and the unfamiliar sensation of the drugs beginning to affect its system. For several tense minutes, it appeared that the bear might charge the rescue personnel or return to attack the aircraft. Dr. Webb watched the drama unfold while continuing to monitor Richard's condition. The pilot's injuries had stopped bleeding significantly, but he needed proper medical attention to prevent infection and ensure that no internal damage had occurred. The academic found himself torn between scientific fascination with the wildlife control procedures and human concern for their immediate survival. Jennifer captured the rescue operation on film, documenting the professional approach used by conservation officers when dealing with dangerous wildlife situations. The footage would later be used for training purposes and to analyze the effectiveness of various wildlife control techniques. At 7:55 p.m., the tranquilizer drugs began to take visible effect on the polar bear. The animal's movements became less coordinated, and it began showing signs of sedation. However, polar bears are known for their resistance to tranquilizers, and the conservation officers maintained their defensive positions until they were certain the animal was fully immobilized. The search and rescue team, which had been waiting at a safe distance, moved in to begin evacuating the 3 survivors as soon as the conservation officers confirmed that the bear was unconscious. Medical personnel immediately began treating Richard's injuries while preparing Jennifer and Dr. Webb for transport to Baker Lake's medical facilities. The evacuation of the crash site was conducted with efficiency and professionalism that reflected the extensive training of Northern Rescue personnel. However, the presence of Nathan's body and the massive unconscious polar bear created a surreal scene that would remain burned in the memories of all participants. Richard was transported by snowmobile to the waiting ambulance at the nearest accessible road, approximately 5 kilometers from the crash site. His injuries, while painful, were determined to be non-life-threatening, though he would require observation for potential complications, including infection and psychological trauma. Dr. Webb and Jennifer were also evacuated to Baker Lake's medical facilities for evaluation and treatment. The academic had sustained only minor injuries during the crash, but the psychological impact of witnessing Nathan's death and their own near-death experience would require professional attention. The recovery of Nathan's body was conducted with appropriate respect for Inuit cultural traditions, with input from community elders and his family members. The elderly guide's sacrifice in attempting to protect his companions was recognized as an act of extraordinary courage that exemplified the values of his culture and heritage. At Baker Lake Health Center, Richard received medical treatment for his chest wounds, which required cleaning, antiseptic treatment, and preventive antibiotics to guard against infection. The bear's claws had created 4 parallel lacerations across his chest, none of which had penetrated deeply enough to cause serious internal damage. Dr. Webb was treated for his mild concussion and released after several hours of observation. The academic would later write extensively about the experience, contributing valuable data to research on human polar bear interactions and survival psychology in Arctic environments. Jennifer's bruised ribs were X-rayed and determined to require only pain management and rest. However, the psychological impact of the experience would influence her subsequent documentary work and her perspective on human relationships with Arctic wildlife. The investigation into the circumstances of the crash and Nathan's death was conducted by multiple agencies, including the Transportation Safety Board of Canada, Nunavut conservation officers, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The findings would contribute to improved safety protocols for aviation operations in polar bear country. The polar bear, once the tranquilizer drugs wore off, was relocated to a remote area far from human habitation. Conservation officers determined that the animal had behaved according to natural predatory instincts rather than showing abnormal aggression, and therefore did not pose an ongoing threat that would require its destruction. Media coverage of the incident focused on the dangers of climate change driving polar bears into increasing conflict with human activities, the heroism of Nathan Crowfeather's sacrifice, and the skill of Richard Thompson in successfully crash-landing his aircraft with no fatalities among his passengers due to the accident itself. The investigation into the aircraft accident determined that the combination of unexpected severe weather, carburetor icing, and extreme turbulence had created conditions beyond the capability of any pilot to safely navigate. Richard's actions during the emergency were deemed exemplary and likely prevented additional fatalities. Sarah Thompson and the children were flown to Baker Lake immediately upon notification of the accident. The family's reunion was emotional and profound, with all members recognizing how close they had come to losing Richard entirely. The pilot's physical recovery would take several weeks, but the psychological healing would require much longer. Nathan Crowfeather's funeral was attended by hundreds of community members, government officials, and representatives from across Nunavut. His traditional knowledge and cultural contributions were celebrated alongside his final act of courage in attempting to protect his traveling companions from the polar bear attack. Dr. Webb returned to his position at the University of Alberta, but found his research focus shifted toward human-wildlife conflict and survival psychology. His first-hand experience with Arctic survival provided unique insights that enhanced his academic work and teaching. Jennifer completed her documentary project, but its focus expanded to include the human costs of climate change and increasing human-wildlife conflict in the Arctic. Nathan's story became a central element of the film, which was dedicated to his memory and contributions to cultural preservation. The crash site was eventually cleaned up by environmental crews, with the aircraft wreckage removed and the area restored to its natural condition. However, the events of September 2nd, 2025 would be remembered as a stark reminder of the dangers inherent in Arctic travel and the increasing pressures that climate change was placing on both human communities and wildlife populations. Richard Thompson returned to flying after a 6-month recovery period, but his experience had fundamentally changed his approach to Arctic aviation safety. He became an advocate for improved polar bear safety protocols for remote landing sites and contributed to the development of enhanced emergency equipment standards for northern operations. The footage captured by Jennifer during their ordeal was used extensively for training purposes by search and rescue organizations, conservation officers, and aviation safety instructors. The material provided unprecedented documentation of polar bear behavior during a human encounter and the psychological responses of people facing life-threatening wildlife situations. Dr. Webb's subsequent research into the psychological aspects of survival situations drew heavily on his personal experience during the crash and bear attack. His work contributed to improved training protocols for researchers, pilots, and others who work in remote Arctic environments where polar bear encounters are possible. The memory of Nathan Crowfeather's sacrifice continued to influence all 3 survivors long after their physical recovery was complete. His traditional knowledge, cultural wisdom, and final act of courage served as a reminder of the values and strength that had allowed Inuit peoples to thrive in the Arctic for thousands of years. The incident also contributed to ongoing discussions about climate change impacts on polar bear behavior and distribution. Scientists noted that changing sea ice patterns were forcing bears to spend more time on land, increasing the probability of human-bear conflicts in areas that had previously been considered relatively safe. Conservation officers used the incident as a case study for training purposes, analyzing the effectiveness of various wildlife control techniques and the importance of rapid response capabilities in remote areas. The successful tranquilization and relocation of the bear demonstrated that non-lethal solutions were possible even in extreme situations. The Baker Lake community, which had long coexisted with polar bears, used the incident to advocate for improved safety protocols and support for traditional knowledge keepers who understood wildlife behavior patterns. Nathan's death was seen as a loss not only of an individual, but of irreplaceable cultural knowledge and wisdom. Richard's recovery included not only physical healing, but also psychological counseling to address the trauma of the crash, the bear attack, and witnessing Nathan's death. The pilot worked with specialists experienced in treating aviation-related trauma and survival situations. Sarah Thompson became an advocate for improved family support services for the wives and children of northern pilots, recognizing that the psychological stress of watching loved ones face daily dangers in remote flying operations affected entire families, not just the pilots themselves. The three children, Michael, Emma, and Thomas Thompson, struggled with understanding how close they had come to losing their father. Family counseling helped them process the trauma of nearly becoming orphaned and their father's physical and emotional recovery from the attack. Jennifer's documentary, when finally completed and released, won several international awards for its authentic portrayal of Arctic life and the human costs of climate change. The film's dedication to Nathan Crow Feather ensured that his story and sacrifice reached audiences around the world. Dr. Webb's academic papers analyzing the psychological and behavioral aspects of their survival experience were published in multiple journals and became required reading in wilderness psychology and survival studies programs. His first-hand account provided unique insights into human decision-making under extreme stress. The Transportation Safety Board's final report on the accident emphasized the unpredictable nature of Arctic weather and the importance of enhanced emergency equipment for aircraft operating in polar bear country. Recommendations included mandatory polar bear deterrent devices and improved survival training for northern pilots. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police investigation into Nathan's death concluded that the circumstances were entirely beyond human control and that no criminal or negligent behavior had contributed to the tragedy. The report praised Nathan's courage and the actions of all survivors during the crisis. Conservation officers noted that the polar bear involved in the attack showed normal predatory behavior and posed no ongoing threat to human communities. The animal's successful relocation demonstrated that human-bear conflicts could be resolved without destroying the wildlife involved. The incident became a case study used in emergency management training programs across Canada, demonstrating the complex challenges faced by rescue personnel when dealing with multiple simultaneous threats, including weather, wildlife, and human injuries in remote locations. Baker Lake Airport implemented enhanced wildlife monitoring protocols following the incident, including regular polar bear patrols during periods of increased animal activity and improved communication systems for reporting wildlife sightings to incoming aircraft. The medical personnel who treated the survivors noted the importance of rapid response capabilities and proper equipment for dealing with wildlife attack injuries. The case contributed to improved training for northern medical facilities in treating bear attack victims. Nathan Crow Feather's family established a foundation in his memory to support the preservation of traditional knowledge and cultural education for young Inuit people. The foundation ensured that his contributions to cultural preservation would continue beyond his death. Richard Thompson's return to flying was marked by enhanced safety protocols and improved emergency equipment. His experience led to the development of new standards for aircraft operating in polar bear country, including mandatory deterrent devices and enhanced survival gear. The psychological impact of the experience continued to affect all three survivors years after their physical recovery. Regular counseling and support groups helped them process the trauma and find positive ways to honor Nathan's memory while moving forward with their lives. Jennifer's subsequent documentary work focused increasingly on climate change impacts and human-wildlife conflict, with Nathan's story serving as a powerful example of the human costs of environmental change. Her films reached international audiences and contributed to greater awareness of Arctic issues. Dr. Webb's teaching was permanently influenced by his personal experience with survival psychology. His students benefited from his first-hand knowledge of human behavior under extreme stress, and his research contributed to improved training protocols for people working in dangerous environments. The crash site, though cleaned and restored, remained a place of pilgrimage for those who knew Nathan or had been touched by his story. The empty tundra, where he had made his final sacrifice, served as a reminder of both the beauty and danger of the Arctic environment. The polar bear that had killed Nathan was never seen again by researchers, having successfully returned to its natural hunting patterns in remote areas far from human habitation. Conservation officers noted that the animal's behavior during the incident was entirely consistent with normal predatory responses. The incident contributed to ongoing research into the psychological factors that influence survival in extreme situations. Nathan's courage, Richard's piloting skill, and the survival instincts demonstrated by all participants provided valuable data for improving training and preparation programs. The Baker Lake community's response to the tragedy demonstrated the strength and resilience that had allowed Inuit peoples to survive in the Arctic for thousands of years. Community support for Nathan's family and the other survivors reflected traditional values of mutual aid and collective responsibility. The international attention focused on the incident helped raise awareness of the challenges faced by Arctic communities as climate change altered traditional patterns of human-wildlife interaction. Nathan's story became a symbol of the human costs of environmental change. The enhanced safety protocols developed following the incident were adopted by aviation operators throughout the Canadian Arctic, improving safety for pilots, passengers, and ground personnel working in polar bear country. Richard's experience contributed directly to these improvements. The medical treatment received by the survivors established new protocols for treating wildlife attack victims in remote northern communities. The case became a training example for medical personnel throughout the Arctic region. The investigation's findings about weather patterns and aircraft performance in extreme conditions contributed to improved forecasting and flight planning procedures for northern aviation operations. The unpredictable nature of the weather system that caused the crash led to enhanced monitoring and communication systems. The psychological support provided to the survivors' families became a model for assisting the loved ones of people involved in traumatic wilderness incidents. Sarah Thompson's advocacy led to improved support services for northern aviation families. Nathan Crow Feather's traditional knowledge about polar bear behavior, shared during their survival ordeal, was documented and preserved as part of his cultural legacy. His insights into wildlife patterns and survival techniques were incorporated into safety training programs. The footage captured by Jennifer during the incident provided unprecedented documentation of human behavior during life-threatening wildlife encounters. The material was used extensively for research and training purposes while respecting the dignity of Nathan's sacrifice. The successful rescue operation demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated response procedures involving multiple agencies. The cooperation between search and rescue teams, conservation officers, and medical personnel became a model for similar operations. The community of Baker Lake's handling of the tragedy and its aftermath reflected traditional Inuit values of resilience, mutual support, and respect for the natural world. The community's response honored Nathan's memory while supporting the survivors and their families. The incident's impact on polar bear research and conservation efforts was significant, providing valuable data about bear behavior and human-wildlife conflict resolution. The non-lethal resolution of the wildlife threat demonstrated effective conservation practices. Richard Thompson's eventual return to normal flying operations was marked by enhanced awareness of wildlife threats and improved safety procedures. His experience influenced an entire generation of northern pilots and contributed to improved safety standards throughout the industry. The long-term psychological recovery of all three survivors involved ongoing counseling and support, but also positive efforts to honor Nathan's memory through advocacy, education, and cultural preservation activities. Their survival carried with it the responsibility to ensure that Nathan's sacrifice was not forgotten. The September 2, 2025 polar bear attack near Baker Lake became a defining moment in Arctic aviation safety, human-wildlife conflict research, and cultural preservation efforts. Nathan Crowfeather's courage and sacrifice ensured that his story would continue to influence safety protocols, conservation efforts, and cultural education for generations to come. The empty tundra where these events unfolded returned to its natural state, but the memory of what occurred there continued to influence policy, research, and individual lives long after the physical evidence had been removed. The incident served as a stark reminder of both the beauty and danger of the Arctic environment, and the courage that ordinary people can display when faced with extraordinary circumstances. The legacy of September 2, 2025 extended far beyond the immediate participants to influence Arctic safety protocols, wildlife conservation efforts, and cultural preservation initiatives throughout the Canadian North. Nathan Crowfeather's final act of courage became a symbol of the values and traditions that had sustained Inuit peoples through countless generations of survival in one of Earth's most challenging environments.